Good morning and welcome to the 34th meeting of the Education, Children and Young People Committee in 2025. I'd like to welcome Ben McPherson, Minister for Higher and Further Education, to the meeting along with his supporting officials. I note that the officials seated at the table are here to support the Minister but are not able to speak in debates on amendments. Members should therefore direct their comments or questions to the Minister. During the meeting we'll also be welcoming a number of non-committee MSPs who are attending for part or all of the meeting today to speak to their amendments and to participate in the debates.
Beginning before we proceed.
Will you, Rennie?
I'm sure the committee would like to join me in congratulating the convener on his award last week. I personally think it was the nominations from George Adam and myself that got it over the line, but whatever, we do we do sincerely congratulate the member for his award.
That is very kind of you, Mr Rennie, and unexpected praise from you and other members, but very welcome all the same. I hope that means we're going to have a very collegiate and good-mannered proceedings on our Stage 2 deliberations of the Tertiary Education and Training Funding and Governance Scotland Bill. Because this is our first Stage 2 on this bill, I've been asked to once again go through the process that we will be following this morning for anyone who is watching online. So, the amendments have been lodged on the bill and they have been grouped together. There will be one debate on each group of amendments. I will call the member who lodged the first amendment in that group to speak to and move that amendment and to speak to all other amendments in the group. I will then call on any other members who have lodged amendments in that group. Members who have not lodged amendments in the group but who wish to speak should catch my attention. If he's not already spoken on the group, I will then invite the Minister to contribute to the debate. The debate on the group will be concluded by me inviting the member who moved the first amendment in the group to wind up. Following the debate on each group, I will check whether the member who moved the first amendment in the group wishes to press it to a vote or to withdraw. If they wish to press ahead, I will put the question on that amendment. If a member wishes to withdraw their amendment after it's been moved, they must seek agreement of other members to do so. If any member present objects, the committee immediately moves to a vote on that amendment. If any member does not want to move their amendment when called, they should say not moved. Please note that any other member present may move such an amendment. If no one moves the amendment, I will immediately call the next amendment on the marshalled list. Only committee members are allowed to vote. Voting in any division will be by a vote show of hands, so it's important that members keep their hands clearly raised until the clerks have recorded the vote. The committee is required to indicate formally that it has considered and agreed each section of the bill, and so I will put the question on each section at the appropriate point. And now we've covered the procedures, we will start the substantive business, and I call Pam Duncan-Glancy to speak to Amendment 38, grouped with Amendments 39 and 207. Pam Duncan-Glancy to speak to and move Amendment 38 and all other amendments in the group. Pam Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. I'd also like to associate myself with Willie Rennie's comments earlier and congratulate the Convener on his award last week. Good morning to the Minister and officials. Amendment 38 in my name requires a national skills and apprenticeship funding strategy that sets out the Minister's priorities for funding national training and apprenticeships with a view to meeting medium and long-term skills needs, how school phase pathways, including foundation apprenticeships and senior phase technical routes, are reflected in the priorities, the intended roles of the bodies to be involved in delivering the priorities, and how ministers intend to measure success in delivering them. Scottish ministers must, in part of this amendment, consult employers, trade unions, employers who are subject to the apprenticeship levy, schools, colleges and universities. It is intended to bring what I think is much needed coherence to the landscape, and something we heard from many stakeholders giving evidence to the bill, that there has to be a far more strategic focus on skills in Scotland, connecting industry, school, education all the way through from cradle to career. 39 amendment in my name, number 39, requires ministers to publish a report which sets out how this meets skills need in industry and in the public sector, so that we can be confident that we don't enter further years of situations where we've got skills gaps in key industries. We've heard recently about some of those skills gaps and the fact that we've had to import skills from other countries. This is something that I think is regrettable, and that we should try to make sure that we're planning properly, not just for areas like in construction or plumbing or welding, but also in the public sector, where we've got significant skills gaps, including in the teaching and in the health workforce. Brought together, I think these two amendments would provide much needed coherence to the skills and education landscape, and I commend them to the committee and hope they can meet with support from members. Amendment 207 is a consequential amendment and commences both of those 38 and 39. Thank you, Convener.
Can you move Amendment 38?
I certainly can. I move Amendment 38.
Thank you very much. Minister.
Thank you, Convener. And may I also express my congratulations to you and the committee more widely on your award, and also thank all members and stakeholders who've engaged between stages 1 and 2, of which we have had substantial and constructive engagement, which I think is to the benefit of all. I will speak to all the amendments in this group together, noting that Amendment 207, as has been mentioned by Pam Duncan-Glancy, is consequential. I appreciate why Pam Duncan-Glancy has laid these amendments. It is desirable for there to be a clear picture for all to understand and to see their role, responsibilities and where the opportunities may sit in terms of having national direction of skills planning. The bill and the wider reforms of the skills landscape that we are introducing seek to do that. The Scottish Government is committed to leading skills planning nationally while strengthening regional approaches. We have agreed a high-level model for skills planning that sets out intended roles for the Scottish Government, the Scottish Funding Council and Skills Development Scotland, consistent with the objectives of the proposed amendment. I'm happy to consider what we might be able to publish ahead of Stage 3, but also want to put on the record this Government's commitment to transparency, collaboration and delivering a system that meets Scotland's strategic skills needs. I'm also happy to take on board many of the aims of Pam Duncan-Glancy's amendments in our approach, not least on consultation. It is, of course, the norm for the Scottish Government to consult and engage with key stakeholders in the development of policy, and I would not intend to deviate from that in terms of our approach on this. However, it also would be inappropriate to tie future governments to a policy approach by making it statutory. The amendments also have some issues in their drafting. For example, elsewhere in the bill, provision is made for work-based learning, which includes but is not confined to foundation apprenticeships. For all these reasons, Convener, I cannot support Amendments 38, 39 or 207, and I would ask Pam Duncan-Glancy not to press them, to allow me and my officials and the Government more widely to consider what more information on our national skills planning approach I can provide to Parliament ahead of Stage 3. Yes.
I appreciate the Minister taking the intervention, and sorry to cut him off in his flow. I was slightly concerned if you were getting to the end of your comments I wouldn't be able to intervene, so forgive me if it didn't flow quite so nicely there with the intervention. In the letter you wrote to the committee overnight, you've mentioned strategic skills priorities will be published by the Government in December 2025. Can I ask the Minister if that document that will be published in December 2025, according to the letter, could include some of the mechanisms that I've included in this particular amendment?
I'm not able to give that firm commitment at this juncture. Of course, it would be important to publish before Parliament the proposals that are set out in the letter that was sent on Monday. What I will say is that I'm very happy to engage with Pam Duncan-Glancy, as always, ahead of Stage 3 on these matters. As I've emphasised, because I do think in terms of the skills planning considerations more widely and with particular reference to these amendments, there is strong alignment across the Parliament on what we want and need to do, and I would suggest that we engage ahead of Stage 3. However, I would also urge Pam Duncan-Glancy not to push these amendments, and if she does, I encourage members to vote against them.
Thank you very much. I call Pam Duncan-Glancy to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 38. Ms Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you, Convener. I'm prepared to give the Minister the benefit of the doubt and to work between now and Stage 3. I think it is important that in a bill such as this, we do set clearly the link between education and skills. I think that's lacking in the bill currently as drafted. I think this amendment could have brought some coherence and direction that isn't there, but I am prepared to discuss this with the Minister between now and Stage 3, and also to look at what the Minister may publish ahead of Stage 3, as outlined in the letter that came on Monday. Forgive me, not yesterday, today is Wednesday. And so I'm not going to press that. Thank you.
Pam Duncan-Glancy seeks to withdraw Amendment 38. Does any member object? No member objects. Amendment 38 is withdrawn. I call Amendment 39 in the name of Pam Duncan-Glancy, already debated with Amendment 38. Pam Duncan-Glancy to move or not move?
Not move.
I call Amendment 1 in the name of the Minister, group with amendments as shown in the groupings. Minister to move Amendment 1 and speak to all other amendments in the group. Minister.
Thank you, Convener. My amendments 1 and 2 insert references to post-16 education bodies into sections 3 and 4 of the 2005 Act as amended by the Bill. These are the general duties on the Scottish Ministers and the SFC, and the amendments align with the language previously used in the provisions and throughout the 2005 Act. These amendments respond to concerns raised by the EIS about creeping privatisation of tertiary education, which is absolutely not the policy intention nor the effect of the drafting of the bill. I have listened to these concerns of the EIS, and I am happy to provide these amendments by way of reassurance that there is no shift in this direction. I hope members can support them, and I move Amendment 1 in my name. I am pleased to support Amendment 25, also in the name of Willie Rennie. The need for provision to address current and future economic need is fundamental to the planning and provision of tertiary education and funding, and I expect that would be true of all Scottish Government administrations. With regard to the other amendments in the group, I will wait to hear the debate and members' comments and provide my views in my closing remarks. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. I call Miles Briggs to speak to Amendment 40 and other amendments in the group. Mr Briggs.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Committee. And to complete the loving, can I congratulate you, Convener, on your award as well. I'll be speaking to Stephen Kerr's amendments in this group as well, as he can't join us today. But to begin on my own, Amendment 40, this amendment goes to the heart of the change proposed, namely to remove the duty to secure the provision of Scottish apprenticeships and work-based learning from Skills Development Scotland and place that with the Scottish Funding Council. Organisations such as the EIS do not believe that SFC should have the duty to secure the provision of Scottish apprenticeships and work-based learning on the basis that they may dilute the administrative and oversight functions with one organisation being stretched too thin. My amendment would therefore provide for a status quo option to be retained, and my solution would be for the next Parliament to look towards, as I've discussed with the Minister, a Skills Training and Colleges Bill to tidy up some of the concerns which the committee have highlighted in our report earlier on in this session. Amendments 41, 42, 44 and 45 relate to the alignment of the bill with national priorities and career pathways, as well as regional skill shortages, as Pam Duncan-Glancy mentioned. And I welcome Amendment 1 from the Minister. That was also an amendment I was looking to bring forward. Moving to Amendments 43 and 46, in the name of my colleague Stephen Kerr, the general duties placed on ministers in Section 2 set the tone for the entire bill. If these duties lack clarity or force, then everything that follows in the legislation rests on an uncertain foundation. The amendments in Stephen Kerr's name are designed to correct that weakness and to ensure that the duties of ministers are aligned with the practical realities of Scotland's economic and skills challenges. Yes.
Pam Duncan-Glancy.
I thank the member for taking this intervention, and I'm conscious that he's moving on behalf of his colleague Stephen Kerr. We've had correspondence from University Scotland who have some concerns around the difficulty associated with assessing what is productivity and that it is shaped by multiple factors beyond university and indeed other education institutions. Do you know if the member has considered this?
Miles Briggs.
So I know from conversations that the member's open to drafting of amendments. It's more making sure that the foundations of the bill will look towards across sectors. So I know the member and has given me flexibility around moving or not moving these amendments to have that opportunity to get this right as we go forward. So turning to the First Amendment 43, the argument here is simple but crucial. Scotland invests millions of pounds every year in tertiary education and our skills system, yet the bill introduced contains no explicit requirement for ministers to demonstrate that this expenditure leads to improved outcomes. It does not require ministers to demonstrate improvements in the skills of the workforce, in productivity or in the achievements of learning, without the requirement that is a real risk that we create a structure in which money continues to be spent without any meaningful connection to the economic needs of our country. Scotland faces a number of serious and well-documented productivity challenges. Employers repeatedly identify skill shortages with each and every one of us on this committee as one of the principal barriers to growth in our economy. If the bill does not oblige ministers to consider whether their decisions are actually improving that situation, then we risk entrenching an accountability gap at the very heart of the system. So Amendment 43 ensures that public investment must be tied to measurable improvements. If it requires ministers to reflect on outcomes, not simply on intentions, and to consider the impact of their decisions on productivity and on the skills Scotland needs for the future. And this amendment introduces the discipline and transparency that should be expected in any modern skills system, in which this bill, as drafted, currently lacks. Amendment 56 follows naturally from that logic. If we are transferring significant responsibilities to the Council, responsibilities over apprenticeships, national training programmes, work-based learning and the wider landscape of post-school provision, then Parliament must be able to assess at regular intervals whether those responsibilities are being carried out effectively. So the bill currently provides no structured mechanism for independent valuation of the Council's performance. That omission leaves Parliament dependent on ministerial assurances going forward rather than objective evidence. Amendment 46 addresses the gap by requiring an independent evaluation of the Council every 3 years with a report laid before Parliament. This is not an undue burden, it is a reasonable expectation when the Council is being asked to steward such a large portion of Scotland's skills system. Independent evaluation prevents complacency, protects learners and employers, and ensures that the system adapts to Scotland's economic needs as they change. It also provides Parliament with a reliable basis on which to judge the success of the reforms over a period of time. If the Government believes this bill will improve Scotland's skills landscape, then it should have no hesitation in welcoming the scrutiny that this amendment would provide. Convener, these amendments reflect Stephen Kerr's consistent argument that Scotland needs a tertiary system grounded in evidence, focused on outcomes and transparent in its operation. Amendment 43 ensures that ministerial decisions must contribute meaningfully to the skills and productivity that Scotland's economy requires. And Amendment 46 ensures that the Council's performance will be judged independently and openly, rather than being left to an assumption. Together they strengthen the bill, I believe, strengthen accountability and strengthen the prospects of delivering a skills system worthy of Scotland's workforce. And I therefore invite colleagues to support Amendments 43 and 46, and I move the other amendments in my name.
Thank you very much. I call Willie Rennie to speak to Amendment 24 and other amendments in the group. Mr Rennie.
So I've got a couple of amendments in this group, 24 and 25. I'm really pleased the Minister's supporting 25 to try and get a whole system approach, making sure that the system is connected in with the wider economy. We know there is a gap between the demand and the supply, and we should be trying to close that gap, but also making sure that the shape of the offer actually meets industry and employers' needs. So I think that's great that the Minister is supporting Amendment 25. 24 is the crunchy one. It kind of reintroduces an industry-led body equivalent to what we've had just now, which is SAB, the Apprenticeship Advisory Body. And the reason for this amendment is to try and address some of the anxieties that exist within not all employers, but quite a lot of employers who feel that this is an unnecessary bill, it's a distraction, and that, more importantly, it will lead to a dilution of the voice of employers. Now, I appreciate there is a committee that will be set up as part of the Funding Council, but to have an industry-led body which has an independent status, which has a role of oversight onto the decisions made by the Funding Council and the rest of the system, will, I think, address some of those concerns. So I would urge the Minister to support that. It's part of OECD recommendations where they have said there should be a statutory framework enabling employer-led oversight. It's the model. Yes, certainly.
Ross Greer.
Thank you. I'm sympathetic to the argument that Willie Rennie is making around having that independent body. What I'm wondering is, does he think it would be necessary to have both that and the apprenticeship committee that the bill sets up, because while I'm sympathetic to his argument, I'm worried about having both of them in existence at the same time, and I'm wondering if there's another way to do this that makes the committee that the bill would establish more independent from the SFC and from government, rather than setting up a body that in a lot of ways is potentially going to duplicate the work of the one that's already set out in the bill.
So I'm not in favour of duplication. I think if we were able to have a more independent status, which employers felt that they owned rather than when chosen to come onto it, then I think that would address some of those concerns. So if we can get to a stage where we can have a discussion about improving that independent status and the ownership by employers and industry, I think we may be able to address those concerns. But I'm not in favour of having two structures. That would just be pointless and competitive. So I'm not in favour of that. But it is the model that's adopted in many other countries, like in Germany, Switzerland, Denmark, as well as Canada, Korea, and of course the United States have that model as well. I'm not sure if that's a recommendation or not, but this is this kind of standard that's accepted because it partly reflects 25, the Amendment 25, about having that general duty to make sure that the system's tied in with economic needs. If you've got that in tandem with a body that is felt by employers as being their body, that's got an oversight role, then I think together as a package we can make sure that these reforms would work. Yeah, certainly. Yeah.
I thank the member for taking that intervention, and we're supportive. I'm supportive of Amendment 25 in his name. Amendment 24, we support the creation of an industry body. Would the members consider Amendments 181 in Daniel Johnson's name, which gives it's in a much later group, forgive me, but that stipulates what the role of that could be, which I think could address some of the duplication issues that Ross Greer mentions, and sets out that the role would be very specific, and that would be our preferred approach. Would Willie Rennie consider that?
Willie Rennie.
As always, I'm reasonable. I'm prepared to discuss all of that, and I think Daniel Johnson's amendments are worthy of consideration. So yes. That's my main arguments, and I hope to receive the Minister's response in his summing up.
And we move to the Minister summing up. I call the Minister to wind up the debate.
Thank you, and I appreciate it. Listen to fellow MSP's feedback on their amendments and proposals. Amendments 40 and 42 in the name of Miles Briggs, as has been set out, would seek to remove apprenticeships and work-based learning from the SFC's duty to secure coherent provision and Minister's duty to provide appropriate support for them. Amendment 40 would not stop the SFC getting the new functions in the bill. It would just remove obligations to do so coherently. And Amendments 40 and 42 would also fundamentally undermine our policy ambition for parity of esteem and cohesion across the tertiary education sector and training. And therefore, I cannot support Amendments 40 and 42. Amendment 24, in the name of Willie Rennie, as has been argued, effectively reinstates SAB. And I've appreciated my engagement with SAB in this role so far, and we had a very helpful meeting, I felt, between stages 1 and 2. I really value the expertise of SAB and the board, and of SAB, and the board of the Council will continue to play an important role in preparing for the transition of the responsibilities to the SFC along with the board of SAB, and that collaboration and engagement is appreciated. However, the provisions in Amendment 24 duplicate the intended functions of the Apprenticeship Committee, as Ross Greer commented on, which the bill would establish. Our view is that the proposals in Amendment 24 would add clutter to the landscape and incur additional costs at a time when we are trying to achieve the opposite. The Apprenticeship Committee is, in the view of the government, the successor to SAB and can have such subcommittees as the SFC consider appropriate. So there could be additional subcommittees for further input. And therefore, I'm hoping with this explanation that Willie Rennie might not press his Amendment 24.
Willie Rennie.
So the key elements that Ross Greer and I and Pam Duncan-Glancy kind of debated was the independent status. And if having a subcommittee doesn't sound as substantial as a fully flourishing board with a degree of independence. So can the Minister look at appointments, how the process works, to any committee or arrangement, to make sure that industry and employers feel that they aren't just the chosen few, that they are the ones that are representative of the wider sector and have a degree of independence in order to provide the necessary challenge that I think might be necessary within the system. So can we look at that when we come to stage 3 to make sure we can strengthen that independent status? Is that something you would consider?
Minister.
I would be happy to give that undertaking to consider that ahead of stage 3. I have heard very clearly the views of Willie Rennie and others in the stage 1 debate and thereafter about the need for us in the government to underline and emphasise to business and industry that their input through the Apprenticeship Committee and in other ways is absolutely vital. And I was very clear that I wanted to make sure that I was able to emphasise to business through the amendments that some of the amendments that we're bringing, and also through the process of this bill, that we want to make sure that the input from business is really significant and appropriate. So happy to consider the suggestions that Willie Rennie's made. In terms of Stephen Kerr's Amendment 43, I'm concerned that this is ambiguous around what constitutes measurable improvements in skills, productivity and learner achievement. Obviously, it would be the intention of the Scottish Government or this Scottish Government or any other Scottish Government to provide funding which supported improvements in skills, productivity and learner achievement. The terms and conditions of funding which ministers can impose on the SFC under existing powers in the 2005 Act and the bill would, in my view, be the appropriate vehicle to seek to achieve these outcomes. Moving on, I have no objection to the rationale behind Amendments 44 and 45 in the name of Miles Briggs. However, they name specific strategies in primary legislation which inevitably will evolve over time, even if only by name. However, I appreciate what the member is trying to achieve, and if he agrees not to press these amendments, I would be willing to consider something similar, framed in more general terms, at stage 3. Again, I can understand the motivation behind Amendment 46 in the name of Stephen Kerr. The performance of the SFC is important now and will be even more so when the additional functions set out in the bill are conferred upon it. We will monitor the SFC's performance during the transition to new arrangements and thereafter. However, I am concerned that a statutory requirement for an independent evaluation of the performance of the Council every 3 years could be expensive and not necessarily achieve the desired outcome.
Would the Minister give way?
Yeah.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way. Could he outline how he currently monitors the performance of the Scottish Funding Council?
So the performance is measured through the 2005 Act and the proposals that were the stipulations that are set out there. I do think moving forward there is merit in taking an approach to the evaluation, but would wish to consider the timescales involved, and therefore I would hope that.
Sorry, would you give way again?
Stephen Kerr, Miles Briggs might not press his amendment to allow me to consider something more appropriate in terms of timescales for stage 3.
I wonder if the Minister would give way again.
I'll just sum up, Convener, if that's okay. In summary, I would encourage members to support my amendments 1 and 2, and I support Willie Rennie's amendment 25, and I encourage members to vote for it. I encourage members to vote against Miles Briggs's amendments 40 and 42, should he press them, although I've said what engagement would be helpful to have ahead of stage 3. Given our discussion, and the undertaking I gave, I hope Willie Rennie will not press his Amendment 24, but if he does, I encourage members to vote against it. And the same applies to Stephen Kerr's Amendment 43. And I invite Miles Briggs not to press his Amendments 44 and 45, and should he do so, I encourage members to vote against them. And finally, similarly with Stephen Kerr's Amendment 46, I hope it's not pressed, but if it is, I encourage members to vote against it. And sorry, I should have said that obviously we'll have engagement with Miles Briggs on 44 and 45, but I was very clear that 40 and 42 we don't think are of merit in any way. Thank you.
The question is that Amendment 1 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 40 in the name of Miles Briggs, already debated with Amendment 1. Miles Briggs, to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 40 be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We are not agreed. There will be a division. Those in favour of Amendment 40? Those against? Thank you. The result of the vote on Amendment 40 is yes 3, no 7. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. I call Amendment 41 in the name of Miles Briggs, already debated with Amendment 1. Miles Briggs, to move or not move?
Not move.
The question is that Section 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are agreed. I call Amendment 2 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 1. Minister, to move formally?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 2 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are agreed. I call Amendment 42 in the name of Miles Briggs, already debated with Amendment 1. Miles Briggs, to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 24 in the name of Willie Rennie, already debated with Amendment 1. Willie Rennie, to move or not move?
Not move.
I call Amendment 25 in the name of Willie Rennie, already debated with Amendment 1. Willie Rennie, to move or not move?
Move.
The question is that Amendment 25 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are agreed. I call Amendment 43 in the name of Stephen Kerr, already debated with Amendment 1. Miles Briggs, to move or not move?
Not moved.
The question is Section 2 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are agreed. I call Amendment 44 in the name of Miles Briggs, already debated with Amendment 1. Miles Briggs, to move or not move?
In light of what the Minister said, not moved.
I call Amendment 45 in the name of Miles Briggs, already debated with Amendment 1. Miles Briggs, to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 48 in the name of Pam Duncan-Glancy, group with Amendment 49. Pam Duncan-Glancy, to move Amendment 48 and speak to both amendments in the group. Ms Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you, Convener. Amendment 48 requires that there is a new funding model for colleges within 1 year of royal assent of the Act. This is absolutely fundamental and is one of the reasons why we couldn't support the bill at stage 1, because we felt that the movement, the disruption...
Ms Duncan-Glancy, if I interject, in my haste to get through amendments, I did not call Amendment 46 in the name of Stephen Kerr, already debated with Amendment 1, and to see if Miles Briggs wished to move Amendment 46.
And that is not moved.
Not moved.
Yep.
So we continue, and I apologise for interrupting Ms Duncan-Glancy.
No problem at all, Convener, thank you. Amendment 48 requires that the government set out a new funding model for colleges. This is something that's been discussed and spoken about for a number of years. Colleges have been crying out for clear direction. They've been crying out for flexibilities within the funding model, and indeed a new funding model altogether. We've heard about the tripartite group that has been set up, and we know that there are some systems and flexibilities that have been offered to colleges, but through the evidence that we've heard in this committee and that Audit Scotland have collected and that the SFC report has highlighted, these flexibilities have not put colleges on the stable footing that is necessary for them to continue as the skills engines of our regions, and indeed the opportunity centres for young people and skills career switchers. For this reason, I think that in order for any system to work in the way that the government has envisaged, we absolutely have to sort out the crisis that is facing Scotland's colleges before we can expect them to deliver any sort of structural change which this is doing. There's been concern about diversion from frontline, there's been concern about diversion from purpose and principle, there's been concern about diversion from addressing the real skills needs across the country. My amendment number 48 seeks to say this diversion cannot continue beyond at least a year of the royal assent should the bill pass at stage 3. I think it would be perfectly reasonable for the government to deliver such a promised funding model within 12 months of the bill's royal assent if it passed. Yes, I'm prepared.
John Mason.
Yeah, thank the Member for giving way. Does she not think this is really a budget question that's better taking part in the debate on the budget rather than in this legislation?
Pam Duncan-Glancy.
I thank the member for that intervention, but to be quite honest, there never appears to be a good time for this government to look at the funding model for colleges, and every time it is suggested, it is kicked down the road further and further away, and it's not this. Let's wait to the next opportunity. The member suggests the next opportunity is the budget. There are clearly budget implications for such a funding strategy, but nonetheless, colleges are left in complete limbo. They're now delivering learning to 30,000 fewer students than they were before. The staff that have been cut from colleges is the biggest staff cut in the public sector in Scotland. Colleges are now in a precarious situation where they are trying their very, very best, delivering incredible education to young people and career switchers across the country. They've got really high satisfaction rates, but they're doing it without the support of their government because their government is making it almost impossible. Audit Scotland said it, the SFC have said it, people across Scotland can see it. What this attempts to do is put the government's feet to the fire and say, stop promising that these things will change. Stop promising a different model for funding colleges without delivering it. That's why Amendment 48 has been brought in my name. I don't think any of the changes in this bill that look at structural changes, rejigging of quangos, can address these fundamental concerns on skills gaps across the economy and indeed across the public sector if the government don't get to grips with the reality that colleges are facing. And that's why I brought Amendment 48 in my name. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. I call Miles Briggs to speak to Amendment 49 and other amendments in the group. Mr Briggs.
Thank you, Convener. And I welcome Pam Duncan-Glancy's Amendment 48 and very much endorse what she just had to say, because for many of us, we hope this bill would have been a real vision for the college sector, would have been an opportunity to realise their potential. On Monday, I visited Angus and Dundee College. I believe the week before, Willie Rennie had been there as well. It turns out he makes a better Sparky than I do, from what I was told. But it's really important that we look towards how we do realise the potential of our college sector going forward, especially around the resources they can potentially have access to. That's why I welcome Pam Duncan-Glancy's amendment. And my amendment... Yes.
John Mason.
I mean, I do fear we're getting into a kind of budget debate here, but would the member like to suggest if more money is going to the colleges where it should come from, I would suggest higher taxes. Would you agree with that?
Miles Briggs.
So, as you will know from my amendment, it's a review of that credit funding available. And one area which I'm really passionate about, and the member will know I've mentioned a number of occasions in this committee, is where there are other opportunities to look towards funding for our college sector. Ayrshire College is one of the most successful in terms of tapping into local business opportunities with the developments and exciting developments around Prestwick Airport. Each local college should be looking towards their local economies and accessing, I believe, additional opportunities. Here in Edinburgh, our economy is the fastest growing in any part of Scotland, yet the college is not able to move forward in that area and access potentially different streams of funding. So that's where I think this bill could and should have an opportunity to review and look towards different funding models. So my Amendment 49, I think, complements Pam Duncan-Glancy's Amendment 48, requires ministers to carry out a review of the credit-based funding model used by the Funding Council when funding colleges and other providers of fundable further education. The review must examine how fundable education further education provision is delivered across Scotland, including the availability of courses and the capacity of providers to deliver for them. Again, in many colleges, we're hearing that they would do more to deliver many of our key sector skill shortages, especially around construction, if they had additional resource to be able to do that. Ministers would then need to publish and lay a report before Parliament setting out the results of the review and any actions which they intend to respond to. And I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Convener. And before turning to the specific amendments in this group, I just thought it would be helpful to set out what the government is doing currently in this area for full context. So, through the Colleges Tripartite Alignment Group, the Scottish Government, the Scottish Funding Council and Colleges Scotland regularly discuss issues in the sector such as challenges arising from the college funding model. The changes to the funding model implemented by the SFC in academic year 25-26 were in response to requests from the sector to address issues regarding transparency and funding comparability between learners on similar courses and colleges. Ministers issue letters of guidance each year to the SFC setting out strategic priorities. Last year, that letter included specific issues for the SFC to consider when reviewing or updating its funding allocation model. As advised by the SFC at this committee on the 1st of October, the SFC is engaging with Colleges Scotland and the wider college sector on fundamentally reviewing the funding allocation model. While it is... Yes?
Pam Duncan-Glancy.
I thank the Minister for taking that intervention, and I recognise that the work that he describes, but nonetheless, we had the principal of NESCOL tell us that the direction from government wasn't there, and so, in his words, the colleges have cracked on and did it themselves in terms of the strategic approach and priorities. And the concerns from the colleges sector who gave pre-budget scrutiny evidence to us that told us that even the existing model flexibilities were not meeting what they considered to be the demand, both in terms of the scale of demand, but also in terms of meeting need, for example, from young people with additional support needs in colleges, or support for ESOL and other areas. Though none of those things have been addressed. Would the Minister accept that?
Minister.
So, since appointment, I've sought proactively to listen to the concerns and proposals from the college sector, whether that's from the sector body, Colleges Scotland, the relevant unions, including, for example, the EIS, who I met again with yesterday, or specific colleges who I've endeavoured to engage with directly as much as possible within capacity. So I'm very open to listening to and considering both concerns and ideas and proposals from the sector. I would just want to, because I'm just about to pivot into the positives of why I think there's quite a lot of alignment across the Parliament on the need to move forward. So if I may speak to the amendments which may help in answering the intervention from the member. So to continue, while I think, of course, it is important that Scottish ministers are engaged in changes to funding allocations, it is my view that changes must be shaped by the sector itself. Pam Duncan-Glancy's Amendment 48 is broadly similar to Miles Briggs's Amendment 49. Both are largely consistent with the work I have just been describing that the Government has been undertaking and will continue, which makes clear that reviewing funding models does not require statutory underpinning. I thank both members for bringing their amendments forward, but to support both would result in duplication in the view of the Government. I'm therefore content to support Miles Briggs's Amendment 49. I appreciate all that he has brought forward in my tenure in this role so far on the credit system. I think it's been very helpful to listen to his points and concerns on that. I think that his Amendment 49 presents, with respect to Pam Duncan-Glancy, a more cogent proposal for a review. And therefore, I hope that Pam Duncan-Glancy might not press her Amendment 48 and the committee can unanimously vote for Amendment 49.
Thank you. I call Pam Duncan-Glancy to wind up and press her withdraw Amendment 48. Ms Duncan-Glancy.
I thank the Minister for setting out his thoughts and concerns, and I too agree that the funding model must be led by the sector, and indeed the sector are doing everything they can to lead the way and been looking to their government to pick up the mantle on that, and I don't think that that has been done yet. I understand the Minister's support for Miles Briggs's Amendment 49. We will support that amendment too. I think it's important. But I think Amendment 48 gives a slightly broader view of the model that could be considered. And I think actually both amendments are worthy of support from committee. I think my amendment number 48 sets out that it's funding models in the round. That could include the credit-based system, but there are other ways. We've heard about colleges looking for funding or having to chase funding more accurately from different sources when the government decides to create new strategies or plans or ideas that have skills attached to them, and then colleges can go and try and chase funding to deliver some of those skills. That doesn't deliver the longevity, the sense of purpose or direction that colleges need. Instead, that leaves them chasing smaller pots of funding. And so I do think there is a need and an argument to support both models, both amendments, which suggest together could look at the credit model and the wider funding model that colleges sit within, including how colleges deliver the skills for all of the government economic strategies, public sector priorities, so on and so forth. And so that's why I think both amendments should get the support of committee. Thank you.
And you are pressing amendment?
I'm pressing amendment 48.
The question is that amendment 48 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. There will be a division. Those in favour of amendment 48? And those against? Thank you. The result of the vote on Amendment 48 is no, 7, yes, 3. Amendment 48 is not agreed. I call Amendment 49 in the name of Miles Briggs, already debated with Amendment 48. Miles Briggs, to move or not move?
Moved.
Question is that Amendment 49 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 50 in the name of Miles Briggs, group with the amendments as shown in the groupings. Miles Briggs to move Amendment 50 and speak to all amendments in the group. Mr Briggs.
Thank you, Convener. And my Amendment 50 is in relation to Fair Work First, and very much is part of a set of amendments throughout the bill around terms and conditions for apprenticeships and apprentices. This amendment seeks to ensure parity between conditions which will apply for those receiving grants for the purpose of the delivery of programmes of training for employment and those imposed on fundable bodies and regional strategic bodies in terms of repayment in sections 12A, 12B of the 2005 Act. I believe it's vital that in outlaying public money there is clarity in terms of the actions which will be taken if the provider fails to comply with the terms and conditions imposed, and the requirement for the provider to be compliant with Fair Work First criteria, given the links to the Scottish Government policy in this regard. My Amendment 63 I've brought forward really as a probing amendment around the provision of student mental health and wellbeing support services to our young people. Again, on Monday, when I visited Dundee and Angus College, I met with the Student Association and heard from them the support services which they are working to provide their students with. In recent years, funding provided by Scottish ministers to support mental health and wellbeing services has come to an end, and in many cases, colleges and training and other training providers have had to then find the resources to keep these services going. That's why I believe the bill actually presents an opportunity and a chance for us to correct this, and for ministers to create, I believe, a common national framework to make sure mental health and wellbeing support services are actually put in place and put at the heart of our institutions to support students. I'm also very supportive of a number of amendments later on in the name of Ross Greer in terms of how we support the student body in general to deliver these support services, and look forward to hearing more on those. But for now, I move Amendment 50 in my name.
Thank you very much. I call Pam Gosel to speak to Amendment 3 and other amendments in the group. Ms Gosel.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Committee, good morning, Minister and officials, and thank you, Committee, for considering my amendment. This amendment is particularly important as we mark the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. My amendment would give ministers the power to require the Scottish Funding Council to place conditions on anybody receiving funding for post-school education and skills training, ensuring that they take meaningful steps to address gender-based violence against its staff and students. In turn, the body in question must report on an annual basis to the Council on the actions it has taken to prevent intervene in and provide support for individuals who are experiencing or have experienced gender-based violence, as well as outcomes of those actions. While
John Mason.
I thank the member. Can she be more specific where she thinks the problem is at the moment? Because, for example, Kelvin College in my area has really taken a lead on this. And so I've seen at least one college. Does she think some of the colleges and universities are not being so active?
Pam Gosel.
I thank the member for that intervention. Right now, there's no uniformity in the colleges and across the piece. And if you can hear further why I've put this amendment in, obviously a tragedy did happen and many are happening as we see. And I think it's important for the committee to hear the fact that it's not uniformal. And I know that personally because I have been working on a lot of this stuff outside to speak to colleges and universities in relation to this sort of training and awareness. And right now there's no uniformity. While drafting this amendment, I engaged with Fiona Druitt from Emily Test. Almost 10 years ago, Fiona's daughter Emily took her own life after suffering from abuse from her partner who lived in the same University of Aberdeen halls as her. Had the university staff received adequate training in identifying such abusive behaviour, Emily might still be with us today. We know that 1 in 4 female students are reporting unwanted sexual behaviour during their studies, with 1 in 5 experiencing sexual harassment during their first week of term. These are shocking figures. That is why it's so important that anybody receiving this funding not only delivers education and training, but also ensures the safety and well-being of those who rely on its services. I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you. I call Ross Greer to speak to Amendment 51 and other amendments in the group. Mr Greer.
Thank you, Convener. This is, I think, my largest group of amendments on the bill, so I'm going to try and be as brief as possible, but it will probably take a couple of minutes, and I promise to the Convener that I will make that up in later groups. So, Amendment 51 sets out a condition of a cap, which I'm proposing we initially set at 10% on the share of funding that should be paid to managing agents in relation to apprenticeships. We obviously heard in Stage 1 evidence from one trade body that takes a 40% cut, I think cut was the phrase that they used, of the funding per apprenticeship when they're acting as the agents. That's 40p in every pound that's not going to the apprentice or the college. I've heard elsewhere that the figure is above half in some cases, potentially as high as 60%. The percentage of funding that managing agents get in England, though, is capped. Their cap is currently 15%. So the amendment would replicate the English cap in Scottish legislation. I'm proposing that we start at 10%, but I'm not wedded to that specifically. It's more the principle of having the cap there that I think is important. I note that the Minister's Amendment 12, which comes in a later group, does cover similar ground. I don't have any amendments of my own in that group, so I'm just going to touch on it briefly now, because I think it is essentially a direct alternative to my 51. Because the Minister's Amendment 12 gives the SFC responsibility to limit the managing agent's share, but there's no definition in that government amendment of what a reasonable fee may be. It says they need to limit it to something that's reasonable, and it doesn't require the SFC or ministers to then set out what they believe to be reasonable. I think Parliament's received some pretty clear and frankly pretty outrageous evidence on this issue, and it's one where there was a strong consensus on the need for action. Amendment 51 achieves that by setting an initial cap of 10%, but allowing ministers to adjust that cap as they deem necessary in the future. Critically, it shifts the responsibility for setting the cap, for establishing a cap, onto ministers, with an appropriate role for Parliament via the approval of regulation. As I said, I'm not wedded to 10%. I think there's an argument of whether it is 10%. We start at the 15% that's currently the case in England. But what I think is really important is that responsibility for setting the cap should sit with ministers and Parliament here. Yes.
Thank you for taking the intervention. And you set out a very compelling case. Are you suggesting that you would consider waiting to stage 3 to choose the percentage and not press today, or are you going to press on 10% today?
Ross Greer.
I'm grateful for the intervention. I think that will depend in part on the Minister's response in particular. If I was to press it and it was to be agreed, I'd be very open to changing the percentage at stage 3. But equally, if the Minister is agreeable to the principle of what I'm getting at here, which is that responsibility for setting the cap sits with ministers. There's a role for Parliament because it would be via regulation, then I would be happy not to press, and we can come back and hopefully achieve something by consensus at stage 3. What I'm really looking for there is agreement on the kind of core principle of the amendment from the government. Turning to HE, Amendment 54 sets a condition of funding, a requirement that the governing body of a higher education institution should consist of a majority of members who are elected by or chosen by the staff and students. On this proposal, I think it's easiest just to quote briefly from UCU Scotland, who worked with me to bring it forward. They said, and I'm quoting, in our view, the requirement for a lay majority leads to an over-representation of business or retired business voices on courts, which hasn't been to the benefit of universities. Failings in Dundee are down in large part to senior management not being sufficiently challenged by court. In our view, notwithstanding the individuals, the best people to offer robust challenge when it's needed are those most invested in the success of the university, which is primarily its staff and students. End quote. This covers similar ground in principle to the debate that we had recently in relation to the board of the the SQA and then Qualifications Scotland, for which amendments in this space were agreed to. University courts often don't have the right balance of expertise and institutional knowledge required to provide robust governance. External expertise is useful, but having those who are most intimately familiar with the institution and able to offer that detailed and robust scrutiny, I think, is important. Therefore, what I'm proposing here is that we ensure a majority of court members are chosen by the staff and students of the institution. Amendment 55 sets a condition of funding that further and higher education institutions need to operate in a way that's transparent and accountable. This is a general requirement placed on universities and colleges to encourage them to be more open, in particular with decisions they're taking at a senior management level. Again, it's very similar to amendments that we agreed to the Education Bill, so I'm hoping that it will also be agreeable to members. 61 is a base amendment on which 61A through E all rely. This amendment provides the basis for a new section in the 2005 Act that would require ministers to impose terms and conditions for the purposes of encouraging fair work practices by those who are in receipt of funding from the SFC. Yes.
John Mason.
I think that there's an argument being put forward. I'm not saying I agree with it because I'm sympathetic to what he's trying to do here. But I think it was some of the universities were saying that this was straying into employment law. How would you respond to that?
Ross Greer.
There's certainly a careful balance to be struck here. Obviously, employment law is reserved. I'll come to that later on, actually, specifically. This is a question of how public money is to be spent and the conditions that we attach to it, though. So, for example, the Scottish Government doesn't have the power to set the real living wage in Scotland, but what it has done very successfully is set a condition for any business in receipt of a government grant or contract that they must pay at least the real living wage. So that's an example of where we're not able to set wage levels across the board, but where it comes to how public money provided by the Scottish Government, in this case through the SFC, is spent, we are able to attach conditions successfully to that that fall within the scope of devolved powers. We have a case study from the last 4 years of how we've done that in relation to the real living wage. So I think going through some of the amendments specifically here, what I'm trying to improve in part is industrial relations. So the ability of colleges to play the really critical role that they've got in our economy, I think we would all agree, has been held back by a decade of industrial action and this kind of chronic problem of poor industrial relations. The working conditions in universities in a lot of cases are often actually worse. So use the example of graduate teaching assistants who, for example, often tell us about the struggle of being on 0 hours contracts or of having such huge workload pressures that require so much unpaid overtime that they're effectively working in a lot of cases in a number of institutions for less than the minimum wage on an hourly basis. But as I said, colleges and universities receive billions of pounds of public money, and I think that gives us a responsibility to act, and we can use the funding that we provide to drive up conditions in both of those sectors. So going on to the specifics, 61A introduces a 10-to-1 pay ratio as a condition of funding. So anyone employed by a fundable body is paid at a rate which is no less than 1/10 of the salary of the highest paid employee, obviously on an FTE basis. Yes.
John Mason.
I thank you for giving away a second time. I mean, again, I'm very sympathetic to this. I think this kind of thing has been tried. I think Ben and Jerry's tried it, if I remember correctly, and failed. But the counter-argument would be that if our universities cannot attract the best people at the top because they all go to England, America, whatever, our universities would suffer. How would you respond to that?
Ross Greer.
It's always an argument that interests me because it suggests if you're talking about kind of in ballpark terms the salary of the lowest paid employees of a university and you times it by 10, I do find it hard to envisage that we would be unable to attract people of a sufficient calibre if we were offering them salaries in the region of £250,000, which is roughly 10 times the salary, somewhere between £200,000 and £250,000, the salary of the lowest paid employees on an FTE basis. What I'm getting at here is the example that we had in front of the committee recently of one principal whose salary is in excess of £420,000, indeed whose total remuneration package is so big that he couldn't tell the committee accurately how much he's actually paid. I just don't accept that we would be unable to attract people of sufficient quality if we were offering them salaries in the region of or the institutions rather were offering them salaries in the region of £250,000. I think linking their salaries to those of the lowest paid employees doesn't make it impossible to increase the salary of the principal further, but it does mean that those at the very bottom would need to see their salaries increase as well. So it doesn't cap salaries as an absolute. It only caps them relative to the salaries of the lowest paid staff, so it provides an incentive to push their wages up as well. Yes.
Willie Rennie.
So there's obviously nervousness about ONS classification for the universities, and I notice the member hasn't drawn any distinction between the rules that we'd like to apply for colleges and universities. Has he sought advice about the consequences of his proposals and his amendments on the university sector in regard to the ONS classification?
Ross Greer.
So I'm going to get onto some of the specific detail of that in a moment. What I would say is that I have drawn the distinction insofar as, for example, when we come to it, my proposal in relation to the senior management pay of colleges being folded into the public sector chief executive pay framework, I'm not proposing that for universities for precisely the reason that Mr Rennie outlines. I think we can set conditions in relation to the funding that we provide to these institutions, and we can do that. We already do that. So it's a question of how far can we go before compromising ONS classification. Where I've drawn the line here is I think the 10-to-1 pay ratio is appropriate in the case of universities. I don't think it would be appropriate to pull them into the chief executive pay framework because that's for public sector chief executives. Universities are obviously not public bodies. They're largely publicly funded, but they're not public bodies in the way that colleges are, which is why I've proposed that we should bring college principals into the chief executive pay framework. So that's where I'm drawing that particular line, though I recognise that's up for debate. I also recognise the amount of time that I'm taking, convener, so I'll try and rattle through the rest of these. So 61B sets a condition of eliminating the use of 0 hours contracts. Because the government's current fair work criteria does refer to ending the inappropriate use of 0 hours contract, but I can't see any evidence of any action being taken to achieve that, despite it being a government policy objective. And I'm not sure what inappropriate versus appropriate 0 hours contracts would actually look like. I've not heard the government elaborate on that. So again, if the Minister was able to articulate what it is the government are doing to reduce the use of inappropriate 0 hours contracts, I would be open to hearing that. But having pressed the government on that in the past and pressed the SFC, no one has ever provided me with any evidence of action actually having been taken. So 61C would provide the payment of at least the real living wage for all employees who are employed by funded institutions. Pretty simple argument behind that. Everybody deserves a wage that they can live off, one that's enough to pay their bills, and public bodies like colleges, institutions in receipt of huge amounts of public funding like universities, I think should lead by example when it comes to a livable wage for their staff. Yes.
Pam Duncan-Glancy.
I too wholeheartedly agree with the points just made. Can I ask why the term sufficient has been used as opposed to linking directly with the minimum and living wage instead?
Ross Greer.
So the national minimum wage is not a livable wage. The real living wage is a little bit, as it currently stands, the real living wage is a little bit higher than the national minimum wage. But the real living wage isn't defined in law. It's a concept that we're all familiar with, but it's not a concept that's clearly defined in law. So what I'm trying to do is come up with some legal language here that gets to that point of, i.e. sufficient to live above the poverty line. That is the real living wage. But if I was to just put the real living wage in here, it wouldn't mean anything. It's a concept we're familiar with, but it has no existing statutory underpinning attached to it. Yeah.
Pam Duncan-Glancy.
I agree, and I think in principle what the member is trying to do is the right thing to do. I worry that sufficient and adequate are both quite subjective statements, And I wonder if there's any way that ahead of stage 3 something could be done to make that a bit clearer, so that we could achieve the aim without the subjectivity that I think is indicated in 61C.
Ross Greer.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to take that on board. I would never claim that my drafting is perfect in these regards. And if there's a way that we can strengthen it and really make the point that what we're talking about is a wage that allows you to live above the poverty level, which I think is where there is broad consensus, then if there's different language ahead of stage 3 that we could agree to, then I would be very open to that, certainly. So 61D I've already covered in response to Willie Rennie's intervention. That's about college principals being folded into the public sector chief executive pay framework. Colleges are currently an outlier here because they are the only set of public bodies in Scotland that this currently doesn't apply to. The only other example would be Scottish Water, but that's not a public body, it's a company that is just government owned. So college principals are the only leaders of public sector organisations not currently covered by the Chief Executive Pay Framework, and I've never heard a convincing case as to why that is. So the amendment would just rectify that and bring them into line with the rest of the public sector when it comes to pay restraint at the top. And Amendment 61E just gives ministers the power to modify this whole section of conditions, to add, to vary, to remove conditions by regulation, subject to the affirmative procedure. And finally, Amendment 62 places a further condition of funding that fundable bodies ensure that adequate funding is provided to student associations and unions. I think that one is largely self-explanatory. All I would say on that is that it is really important for, just as we were talking earlier on in relation to apprenticeships, for industry to have that independent voice. I think it is important for students of these institutions to be able to have their own independent voice as well, and that is the critical role that's played by student associations and student unions. In the case of colleges, though, it is very often the case that student associations can struggle to sustain themselves in one particular year, and if they essentially fold at that point, it is really entirely down to the management of the college whether they want to put the effort in to restart the student association. That places all the power then in the hands of management and not nearly enough power in the hands of students. So placing that requirement on management to make sure that they are making every endeavour that's appropriate to maintain, to sustain student associations, student unions, whatever form they take, I think is a useful one. And with that, Convener, I will round off.
Thank you very much. Maggie Chapman is joining us remotely, and I call Maggie Chapman to speak to Amendment 52 and other amendments in the group. Ms Chapman.
Thank you very much, Convener, and apologies I can't be with you in person this morning. I remind colleagues two of my register of interests. I am Rector of the University of Dundee. This bill presents an opportunity to reset the governance and accountability framework for Scotland's universities, colleges and training providers. We clearly need firm statutory protections against the kinds of governance failures we've seen recently at the University of Dundee, for example. We know that Dundee's crisis was not inevitable. The Gillis report said clearly that it was caused by a failure, financial oversight, poor internal controls, lack of transparency, weak governance, and a culture that discouraged dissent or scrutiny. The report found that the University Court had been repeatedly presented with rosy narratives rather than accurate, timely data about income decline, cash flow, banking, covenant breaches, and the like, meaning the court was effectively blind to the risk until it was too late. And this isn't just one failure, it's a warning to the entire Scottish higher education sector. Back in 2012, the Konjinsky Review of Higher Education Governance in Scotland laid out many of these risks. It argued that stronger, legally enforceable transparency, accountability and stakeholder inclusion measures were needed beyond what a non-statutory code could guarantee. We see clearly the consequences of ignoring that call. We cannot rely on goodwill, reputational pressure or voluntary codes alone. So my amendments in this group speak to 6 pillars of good governance. Together, they create a statutory goal against secrecy, irresponsible decision-making and unchecked executive power. Amendment 52 makes mandatory the publication of governing body agendas, minutes and papers for major decisions. This ensures transparency so that staff, students and the public can see what the court or board is deciding and on what basis. It removes the ability to hide critical decisions behind closed doors until after the fact. Amendment 57 introduces a governance publication scheme for every institution. It creates a proactive FOI plus regime, if you like. Institutions will publish governance structures, risk registers, internal audit summaries, financial sustainability statements, conflict of interest registers and more regularly and publicly. This means early warning signs, such as deteriorating cash flow or growing risks, become visible long before they reach crisis point. Amendment 58 speaks to transparency and accountability for remuneration, establishing a statutory framework for remuneration committees. Senior pay is too often decided behind closed doors by small groups of insiders. This amendment requires independent external members and ensures staff and student representation. It also requires publication of a full annual remuneration report, including performance criteria and external appointments, essential for accountability. Amendment 59 enables statutory escalation and whistleblowing to the SFC. When internal governance fails, there must be a legally protected external route for concerns from staff, students, governors or auditors to go directly to the regulator. This amendment gives that route. Protected disclosure directly to the SFC with a duty on the institution to notify the Council of material governance failures. Amendment 60 creates a strict code of conflict of interest and disclosure regime. All governing body members and senior officers must declare registrable interests, update them promptly and recuse themselves when conflicted. The register must be public, updated within 28 days, and non-declarational participation while conflicted is in place. And finally, Amendment 53 puts the Scottish Code of Higher Education Governance on a statutory footing. Rather than leaving the code as a soft, voluntary instrument, this amendment would put it on that statutory footing, which is so important, because it will ensure all institutions are legally bound to follow the baseline standards of good governance. The SFC can monitor and issue directions if necessary. Statutory powers are essential. Guidance is not enough. The code alone clearly wasn't enough in the case of Dundee. According to the Guinness report, decisions were repeatedly taken without appropriate paperwork, proper scrutiny, or dissenting voices being recorded. Reliance on institutional goodwill simply failed. A top-down culture of positive narrative and suppression of challenge prevailed. So a statutory regime based on statutory duties, not suggestions, provides real deterrence. It creates legal consequences for non-compliance, or at least the possibility of regulatory intervention. It gives staff, students, and other stakeholders real rights to information, to challenge, to have voices heard through transparent governance structures. These amendments take the next steps to fully implement on contingency review from 2012. And they are called for future stability, integrity and public purpose at Scotland's universities. I urge colleagues to support them this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms Chapman. Can I just say there were some small, slight difficulties in hearing you throughout, so I'm just checking with the Minister and other members that they heard enough. I think it was okay, but it wasn't ideal. I'm getting nods that people are happy. Okay, thank you. I move to Pam Duncan-Glancy to speak to Amendment 56 and other amendments in the group. Ms Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you, Convener. Amendment 56, which I move, is supported by UCU. It says that the training for governing boards must include financial oversight, financial risk, their legal responsibilities as members of that body, their responsibilities in relation to constructive challenge and scrutiny of senior leadership of the higher education institution, and whistleblowing procedures. It says that the Scottish Funding Council must provide guidance on the training and the body must confirm it's happened. Amendment 64 says that a fundable body must have in place a whistleblowing procedure that is clearly communicated to staff, students and members of the governing body of the fundable body, provides for the confidential reporting of concerns relating to issues including, but not limited, financial mismanagement, failure of governance, bullying or retaliation, risk to learner provision, and provides protection against detriment to individuals who raise concerns in good faith. A fundable body must notify the Council when they receive information through the whistleblowing procedure, and on receipt of it, the Council must consider whether any action or support is required as a result of the notification. Amendment 65 puts the known principles of public life on the face of the bill and requires boards to act accordingly to secure funding. Amendment 66 imposes a condition that before implementing any decision that could significantly impact provision for learners, levels of staffing or financial sustainability, the Council must, when making a payment to a fundable body, require that it takes reasonable steps to inform and consult recognised trade unions, organisations representing students of the body and any external partners. It also requires them to report the engagement to the SFC. Yes.
Thank you. Just on Amendment 66, so I very much agree with it in principle. It's very similar to amendments that Pam Duncan-Glancy and I have lodged to previous bills. I'm just wondering in terms of the operability of it, whether it's flexible enough. And the scenario that I'm thinking of is one that a number of institutions have faced recently, where they had to close entire buildings on a moment's notice because of RAC. And that obviously had a significant impact on the ability to provide for learners. But it wouldn't really have been an appropriate situation to require them to inform trade unions, student bodies, etc. beforehand, because they had to do it the moment they became aware. I'm just wondering if the member thinks that her amendment is flexible enough to take into account situations like that.
I thank the member for that intervention. I'm looking at the wording of the amendment just now, and I think that it says specifically take reasonable steps to inform and consult the persons mentioned in subsection 2 before implementing a decision that could significantly impact. So I think if it was time limited in the way that the member has described, and an emergency situation, for example, where they had to close a building in order to look to the safety of both learners and staff, I think the amendment does provide for that flexibility and reasonableness. And it's certainly not my intention that any fundable body should be prevented from taking decisions like that will be time limited rather than more kind of long-term in terms of the impact that it could have on funders and learners. And I hope that the words reasonable and significant are both give that flexibility to the amendment. Thank you. Amendment, just allow me to get back to my notes. Amendment 67 is about appointing chairs and requires that they have certain skills. The ones highlighted are in respect, I think, to the Gillish report, but I recognise that other skills are needed, and it is crucial to take account of communities, class background and so on. But the amendment specifically highlighted some of the skills that I think could have been beneficial in certain situations that have come to light in recent months and years, including in Dundee, that may have helped avoid some of the situations that we've seen. And that's why I've specifically drawn them out. Amendment 68 requires the governing body or the fundable body must have due regard to the views of members representing students and staff, and that they get the same documentation as other members of the governing body, are protected from detriment or exclusion for raising concerns in good faith. It says that this includes giving members representing students and staff reasonable opportunity to present their views, documenting the views of such members, documenting how the governing body responded to them, and, where relevant, the reasons for not aligning with the views of members representing students and staff. Trade unions have told us that their members and Students' Association don't always feel that they have parity with other members on governing bodies. And I think this is incredibly important, given the value that both the trade unions and organisations representing students can bring to decisions that will fundamentally affect learning in any fundable body. And so I think it's really important that that parity exists. Not to have that parity, not to give due regard to the views of students and staff in such forums, really brings back the question, I guess, of is their representation on those boards tokenistic? I think it's really important that they're there, that due regard is given to what they say at the time. The amendments that I've brought forward in this group all seek to strengthen governance, to strengthen decision-making and to strengthen the input that staff and students of institutions have, not to create overburdensome responsibilities on institutions, but rather to make sure that in making decisions are benefiting from the value and the expertise that everyone that is affected by decisions that are made at that governing body will have. We know that, for example, decisions that have been made without proper engagement with trade unions could have resolved even some small concerns had trade unions been properly engaged and given time to negotiate or time to understand what was being put in front of them. Attending these meetings almost in the dark, where you don't have access to the papers that are required to give you the information to be able to input, isn't just about a matter of process and good governance, although that is important too, but it's about valuing the expertise that everyone around the table can bring, not just the chairs, not just members that are there representing other interests, which are, of course, crucially important as well, but also to make sure that any ideas and experience can be drawn on and can benefit the institutions. Just briefly, Convener, if I will, to mention on other amendments in other members' names in this group. I've already spoken to Ross Greer's amendment number 51 on the management agents. The Ross Greer's amendment number 54 on the election to these bodies, I understand why the members brought this. I genuinely do. I worry slightly about the capacity of institutions to do it and to bring forward the elections of that. I also worry about getting people to stand for election, given that all of us have understood the great responsibility and privilege that comes with that. It can be difficult, and I wouldn't want institutions to be in the situation where they couldn't appoint members to positions because of a lack of interest. So those are just my slight concerns on that amendment. On Amendment 62, I'm supportive of Amendment 62. I think it would be important for us to consider what adequate could mean in terms of student associations. I got into politics through student associations. I understand the value that they have, and I think that we have to do everything we can to support them, to provide that incredible expertise, but also opportunity for students to be able to supplement the learning and the formal learning in an institution with learning that we can all get from representing others and being at decision-making tables, as is the case often for people who represent students on associations. Amendment 58 and Amendment 60 in Maggie Chapman's name. Again, I understand why Maggie Chapman's brought those amendments. I worry slightly about the detail in terms of ONS and the classification for ONS and whether it could put that at risk. That's not something that I could support if it was going to put the classification of universities in the ONS classification at risk. And so I have some concerns about those amendments. And with that, Convener, I finish.
Thank you very much. I call the Minister.
Thank you, Convener. And similar to colleagues, I have quite a large contribution here, so please bear with me. Grateful to all members who've brought forward amendments in this group and understand and appreciate the rationale in terms of all the amendments for doing so. Colleagues will appreciate that we have to be very cognizant and considerate about making sure that we make good law, that we avoid unintended consequences, particularly with regard to ONS classification, and that we legislate within the competence of the Scotland Acts. And many of my remarks will be around those areas. First of all, I want to speak to Pam Gosso's Amendment 3. Amendment 3, as has been stated, places a condition on the SFC to require bodies they fund to take action to address gender-based violence against staff and students. As I understand it, the amendment aligns with the Emily Test's goal of ensuring a minimum standard of operation in higher and further education with regard to gender-based violence. This is a goal that, of course, the Scottish Government shares, and I want to pay tribute to the campaign work of Fiona Durrett and the Emily Test and what they've done on this issue, along with other groups that operate and engage in these matters around higher and further education campuses, which Pam Gosso will know prior to rejoining the government, I had quite significant engagement, including in my constituency capacity. We want to continue to work collaboratively with stakeholders such as the Emily Test, Rape Crisis Scotland, Police Scotland, University Scotland and College Scotland to develop an approach that supports colleges and universities in protecting and supporting students. There is good work already going on across higher and further education to address gender-based violence issues in campuses, and the government absolutely intends to build on this. We understand that collectively there is more work to do. However, I have technical concerns about the provision as currently drafted. This requires the provisions as currently drafted requires funded bodies to engage with an evaluated framework. There is currently only one such framework, that is the Emily Test, and engagement comes with financial and resource implications for institutions. There is a risk that the amendment as currently drafted would not be effective if the Emily Test, for whatever reason, were to cease to exist, and there is no alternative framework, and one would need to therefore be identified and developed. But it is clear and right that all parties work together towards the same goal on this issue. And I want to give effect to the aspiration of Pam Gossel's amendment in a way which is practical and deliverable, so that it becomes law and practice that institutions take on responsibility for addressing gender-based violence. So if Pam Gossel were agreeable, and I hope she will be, I would ask her not to press her Amendment 3, so that I might consider further how to introduce a reframed version of the amendment at stage 3. Convener, moving on, I propose speaking to all other amendments by grouping them by member to work methodically through. So first of all, Miles Briggs, he's laid amendments 50 and 63 in this group. Clearly, this government, as the architect of the Fair Work First, has clear expectations about its application right across grant making, wherever and whenever it happens in government. However, I'm not certain we can prescribe its application in law to the SFC and the grants it awards. I am, however, happy to look again at this, and if we come back with something that is workable at stage 3, I commit to doing so. I would therefore ask Miles Briggs not to press his Amendment 50. While I have huge sympathy with the intent behind Miles Briggs' Amendment 63, and would hope that institutions are providing support for students' mental health and well-being in practice without being prescribed to do so, I cannot support the amendment because there is a need to respect the autonomy of our HE institutions in particular, and to avoid attaching so many statutory conditions to their operation through funding that we risk those bodies being reclassified as public ones by ONS. That would create huge issues for government, but also for our institutions, not least compromising their independence, their ability to raise funds from other sources, and to act commercially where it is appropriate to do so. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. for giving way. Could you maybe go into a lot more depth as to how much and where exactly the line is in this? Because I think we're all agreed that we don't want the universities to lose their separate status. But part of me thinks, well, that's a good excuse not to do anything with the universities, because we might be accused of interfering with them. So has he discussed this with the ONS, or has he had advice, or is he clear where the line is?
I think that's a fair challenge for Mr. Mason, and through the last months, I have engaged with University Scotland on the question of ONS classification and the careful balance and sensitivities that there are around it. In terms of in preparation for these amendments and this legislative process, collectively with my advisors here in government, we have, of course, thought carefully about the balance, and we just need to be very careful about the cumulative effect that I've stated. Yes.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way. I've also discussed this with University Scotland, and there seemed to be a lack of understanding or knowledge as to how it would actually be triggered. So what will happen? Does it have to be 10 amendments are passed and it was the 10th one that triggers ONS to say you've lost your classification? I'm unsure. While doing stage 2 and potentially with the Minister agreeing to look at more amendments at stage 3, at what point will that trigger come and how will we know about it?
My understanding is that it's the cumulative effect of and the risk of how that together could create difficulty, as I said, for government and for our institutions in terms of their independence. I'm clear that the risk of reclassification would be brought to the fore should Amendment 63 pass, but I take the points of members, including yourself, Convener, on these points. If I can make some progress, but I'm happy to have further engagement with the committee on the points raised in due course. because these amendments relate to these issues relate to the amendments that I'm still to speak to. Turning to Ross Greer's amendments 51, 54, 55 and 62, as he alluded to in his remarks, I prefer my own amendment 12 in Group 8 to Amendment 51, which addresses the same issues but leaves discretionary power to determine appropriate levels of payment to the SFC. And just for context, in England, the cap is in conditions of funding, not legislation, and is flexible, which I hope is helpful context. Yes?
George Adam.
Thank you, Convener. Minister, it was myself that asked the question when we were going through evidence of the Scottish Northern Ireland Plumbing Employers Federation. And I was shocked when they quite openly I thought I might have to pry for the question, but they just came out with 40% figure of the money that they get from SDS goes to back of house stuff and 60% goes to the training, whereas you know the difference between a college is 90-10 and 10% actually being to the back of house of the college as well. So my concern is, and I think it was the concern of the committee, is that although the figure of 10% is arbitrary, and I'd argue that that's arbitrary and I have concerns about that, there is an argument here, and I'm just wondering, I know you've got your amendment further on, but you know, is this maybe something we can look at some more, get some more, because there was a lot of concern with regards to this issue.
Minister.
First of all, I think it's important to emphasise that our training providers and also managing agents do important work supporting the economy and supporting apprentices. However, I absolutely appreciate the concerns of the committee, and I think it's a legitimate area to probe, absolutely, of the percentage of fees and these considerations. And of course, we can talk about this more when we come to Group 8. But I do, just to answer George Adams' point, I do think that this is an area that we and the SFC should continue to consider and probe. But I do think it's important to leave the discretionary power to determine the appropriate levels of payment to the SFC, and I'm happy to.
Ross Greer.
I'm grateful to the Minister. That's the point that I struggle with, because, and I'm hoping he'll be able to correct me, I don't see any difference between what's in his amendment here and the power that the SDS already has and simply just hasn't been using. It's within SDS's powers right now to effectively cap the amount that managing agents take, and they've just not been doing it. So other than the fact that we're moving responsibility from one body to another, I'm not clear how Parliament can have confidence that this will result in effective caps being set and good use of public money. If the Minister is amenable to work with me further on this, I won't move Amendment 51 at the moment, but what I've not heard yet is a case for why Parliament should be confident that his amendment will result in a change of practice, because it's shifting from one organisation to another, but there's no substantive change in what's then being expected of them. It's very vague, talking about what would be a reasonable charge, etc. So, as I said, I'm happy not to press Amendment 51 at the moment, if the Minister's happy to work with me ahead of Stage 3 to consider whether ultimate responsibility for setting a cap could sit with Ministers.
Minister.
I'm certainly happy, as always, to have more engagement with Ross Greer. The question here, with regard to the points that have been made about SDS, SDS are not bound by law, but the SFC will be and be answerable, and that's the difference. So, and we need to be, as with several amendments in this group, also cognizant of the employment law reservation. But I'm happy to have further engagement. If I can move on.
Would the Minister take one brief further intervention?
Briefly, yes.
Ross Greer.
So I take his point that if his amendment passes, the SFC would be bound by law to do something SDS are not currently bound by law to do. But my question is, bound by law to do what? Because the wording of the Minister's amendment is very, very vague, and I'm just not convinced that it would result in any substantive change in practice.
Minister.
as I've happily said, and would be more than pleased to have further engagement on this point with Mr Greer and with the committee. I also want to emphasise the employment law reservation again that we just have to be considerate about in terms of the contracting. Briefly, yes.
Willie Rennie.
So my anxiety in this area is defining on the face of a bill something that I'm not sure is absolutely defined. But secondly, I think from further evidence that I've had, the situation wasn't as clear as was presented sometimes in the committee. So I would rather the power was lying with the Funding Council with a clear message from this committee and the government that we need to get on top of this to fully understand it, but also to make sure we've got policy that complies with that. So I think it is different enough, which is why I'll support the Minister's amendment rather than Mr Greer's.
Minister.
I thank Willie Rennie from those points and agree with what he's stated. Our member's content for me to move on. Okay. Thank you. Moving on to Amendment 54, I can see the point that Ross Greer is trying to address with Amendment 54, but cannot support it as currently worded. I would, however, ask him not to press it so I can consider it further ahead of Stage 3. I'm happy to accept his Amendment 55, as this provision adds further weight to the imperative of good governance without crossing into determining operational matters. However, I cannot accept Amendment 62. Not only does this risk overstepping into operations and funding decisions of universities, but we must consider what is adequate funding in the context of a diverse range of associations and unions, some of which are aligned with NUS Scotland, while others are not. I want to make clear that I support the principle of Ross Greer's Amendments 61, 61A, 61B, 61C, 61D and 61E. However, as he will be aware, as I've stated already, unfortunately employment law is reserved to the UK Parliament, and that severely limits what this Parliament can do in the areas covered by his amendments. Obviously, I wish that this were not the case and that this Parliament had full legislative power in that area, as well as other areas, but it may be the case that we look to explore whether there is a less direct way of challenging excess pay. So I ask Ross Greer not to press these amendments today to allow me to consider this matter further. And somebody wanted to come in. John Mason.
John Mason.
Thank you very much. I mean, this is exactly the point I raised with Ross Greer earlier on, and his answer was that we are able in other places, like I think through Scottish Enterprise, to insist on a fair work, fair wages and minimum living wage and so on. So why is there a difference here? Because we seem to be able to do it in other areas.
Minister.
I'm grateful for John Mason for raising that point. I think it's important to emphasise the differentiation in that grant conditions are not limited in the same way as legislation and the competence of the Parliament is, and that's the key difference in terms of what Ross Greer raised earlier about grant conditions. And there's obviously a difference between that and primary legislation. So, okay, yeah.
Ross Greer.
I appreciate that. I'm not entirely convinced by that answer, but I accept that that's the government's position, and I acknowledge it insofar as universities or private training providers, etc., would be concerned. Could the Minister just clarify what the government's position is in relation to these policy objectives for colleges? Because colleges are public bodies. The government is entirely within its rights to set conditions in relation to public bodies that are accountable to it ultimately and funded by it operate. And that sits quite separate to matters of employment law. It's essentially internal organisational policy of the Scottish public sector. So could the Minister tease out that distinction there? If I'm understanding his point in relation to universities and where that would stray into matters of employment law, I don't understand how that could apply to colleges when they're public bodies. It's essentially setting internal pay policy.
So, Minister. So again, thanks to Ross Greer for emphasising that specific point. So regarding college principal pay, there are concerns about imposing pay policy via funding conditions, as they may not be appropriate in terms of union engagement, etc. But I could take that away and give that further consideration. But we have to to think carefully about the whole circumstances of that. So if I can give that under
intervention.
Okay, but I'd like to make some progress.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and I appreciate how long we're taking. With respect, I don't understand that answer. Because for a start, in relation to college principal pay, as far as I understand it, college principals in Scotland are not unionised, so that it's not a matter of union engagement being required. Again, in relation to matters like payment of the real living wage, as John Mason's pointed out, as I said earlier, that we've conditioned that elsewhere. The Minister's argument seems to be that he still needs time to consider this. Am I taking that, and I mean no offence by this, am I taking it that the government hasn't yet actually considered this, that the government's come to committee today having not considered this issue? Because I appreciate the time between the deadline for lodging amendments and the first day of stage 2 is quite narrow. But for example, in the matter of applying the Chief Executive Pay Framework to college principals, this is an issue that I've been raising with the Scottish Government for a number of years now. So I'm a bit surprised that the Government doesn't have a clear answer as to what its position is on this and what its view is on the legality of it.
Minister.
So we have considered it, and particularly within the employment law reservation, have to think very carefully. But I've also listened carefully to the arguments that Mr Greer's made at committee today, and points around pay differential and income inequality are of significant interest to me and of pertinence to all of our society and the matters that we consider today collectively as parliamentarians. So I stand by the arguments I've made so far, but I would like to give this further considerations ahead of stage 3, given the keen interest that Mr Greer has expressed in the arguments relayed at committee today. So I would be happy to undertake further consideration to see what more we could potentially consider ahead of stage 3, and that's all I'm going to give an undertaking to today.
Would the Minister take a further intervention?
Yes. Pam Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you, and I thank the Minister for his patience. The point around legislative competence and the difference between that and a grant offer, my understanding is that the way that these amendments are drafted, so I just want to be absolutely clear if this is going to go to stage 3 so that we all know where we stand on it. The current drafting of those amendments make it quite clear that it is about the grant offer, because they say, just to choose one of them, for example, 61D, when making a payment under various sections, require that where a body receiving such a payment. So it is about grant funding. It doesn't appear to me to be about employment law.
Minister.
It's very so there's a difference between grant offering in terms of awards of public resource more widely, and of course we consider that in terms of budget, we've considered that in terms of other circumstances, but we have to be very, very careful in terms of legislative competence about people's conditions and pay, and that is where the employment law reservation is absolutely pertinent here. I mean, of course, it would be better if UK Government devolved employment law to this Parliament, and then we could consider these matters more widely without being restricted. May I move on? Okay, thank you. Moving on to the amendments proposed by Maggie Chapman. So I've already mentioned, and I appreciate the points raised, and including by the convener, and happy to consider following this committee of what more can be provided in terms of the balance. But I've already mentioned the risk of individual amendments in this group potentially having an inadvertent and undesirable consequence in terms of ONS reclassification. I also have to give consideration to the cumulative weight of most of the other amendments in this group passing and what that would mean for the classification of our institutions. I fear that this would be the impact of nearly all of Maggie Chapman's amendments in this group. I appreciate absolutely why Maggie Chapman is seeking to introduce these sorts of conditions. However, I'm conscious that we should respond to the circumstances at the University of Dundee by addressing those, rather than legislating for all with serious potential consequences in the long term for all of our institutions. I would also contend that some of Maggie Chapman's proposed statutory conditions are unnecessary and they already exist in practice. The SFC's terms and conditions of grant include provision to ensure appropriate governance, including compliance with the principles of good governance set out in the sector code. For these reasons, I cannot support amendments 51, 53, 57, 58 or 59 in the name of Maggie Chapman. However, I am happy to support her amendment 60, which would require the SFC to require any fundable body to which it is making payment to have in place a conflict of interest policy. It would mean each member of a fundable body's governing body and each senior officer would need to declare any registrable interest and withdraw from any meeting or decision-making process where there might be a conflict with that interest. It would require fundable bodies to publish, update and review a register of interests. As all of this seems to me to be furthering transparency and simply gives statutory effect to what is already done in practice, it would be useful to make this clear in law of what is expected. The ONS risk also apply largely to Pam Duncan-Glancy's amendments 56, 65, 67 and 68, and therefore I'm not able to support them. I'm happy, though, to support Amendment 64, which would give Scottish ministers the power to require the SFC to require a fundable body to have a whistleblowing procedure in place. The amendment requires the whistleblowing procedure to be clearly communicated to all staff, students and members of the governing body, of which the fundable body sets out an elicited list of the type of matters that must be capable of being reported in confidence and provides protection against detriment from raising any such concern. All of this is highly desirable. I want to thank Pam Duncan-Glancy for introducing this important matter into the bill process and debate. I'm also happy to support Amendment 66, which requires fundable bodies to inform and consult with unions, students and external partners before making decisions on provision for learners, staffing levels and sustainability. While the relevant sector codes already set out a number of principles in relation to staff and student consultation, it would be desirable to make clear expectations for consultation, and I would contend meaningful engagement by underpinning it in statute. Convener, in light of the recent travails in the sector, I and the Government more widely have given careful consideration to all the amendments in this group, and I appreciate why members have brought them. We need institutions to be accountable for their use of public money, but we also need to ensure that government intervention does not interfere with their autonomy. Universities are private sector bodies, and I would hope everyone in this Parliament would wish them to remain so. Too much government control raises, as I've stated, the risk that the ONS would classify them as public sector. I also think we should be cautious about putting onerous or punitive measures in place for every university and college in Scotland because of poor governance in practice and financial management at one outlying institution. However, I agree with members that we need to make sure people have full confidence that public funding is being used efficiently, effectively and wisely, and that is why I have welcomed the responses of the SFC and University Scotland to the Gillies report. It is important that the college and university sectors carefully consider lessons to be learned from the report's findings. The SFC has committed to enhancing the ways in which it monitors institutional governance, and I would expect them to engage closely with the sectors on this work. Powers already in the bill, and which the Government is adding at stage 2, will help them to do this. Although the Gillies report found that the SFC's financial memorandum and sector-owned Scottish Code of Good HA Government remain fit for purpose, we will look to make any appropriate enhancements to prevent a repeat of the situation at the University of Dundee. I therefore wish to reiterate that I cannot support amendments 52, 53, 56, 57, 58, 59, 62, 63, 65, 67 or 68 in this group, and would encourage members to vote against them too for the reasons I've set out already. I also prefer my own Amendment 12, as I have stated, to Ross Greer's Amendment 51. On the same matter, I would encourage members to vote against Amendment 51. I support Amendments 50, 60, 64 and 66 and would encourage members to vote for them. I support Amendment 3 in principle, but ask Pam Gosal not to press it to allow me to consider reframing ahead of Stage 3. But if she does move it today, I would encourage members to vote against it. And I would also ask Miles Briggs not to press his Amendment 50, but if he does, I would encourage members to vote against it. And I would also ask Ross Greer not to press Amendments 61, 61A, 61B, 61C, 61D and 61E. And if he does, I would encourage members to vote against them. Thank you, Convener.
I call Miles Briggs to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 50. Mr Briggs.
Thank you, Convener. And further to the Minister's comments around further discussion, I won't move Amendment 50. Not moved.
And any further wind up on the debate?
Just to come in on my Amendment 63, because I hear what the Minister's had to say this morning. I think for all of us, and to touch upon Maggie Chapman's amendments as well, given the situation in Dundee running parallel to this bill also progressing through Parliament, the transparency issue has been very much in all of our minds. And further to what the Minister said around ONS classification, I hope he can go away and look at actually within the scope of the government where more transparency can be taken forward at Stage 3. I think that's something the committee have all been trying to reach towards. And in relation to my Amendment 63, around mental health and expectations around services and provision, this is maybe not the right vehicle, this bill, to take that work forward, but I think it is something ministers, this committee, will want to see progress made. There is significant variation across the country, sometimes down to organisational capacity, size. Some of the amendments which Ross Greer has brought forward around actually the support which is then given to the student body to be able to provide these services. So I hope the Minister will really consider these issues which are being raised, as well as my colleague Pam Gosal's Amendment 3, and where these can be looked at. If they're not in this bill, then what commitment the government will bring forward to make sure we do progress these issues, because they're very important. And I'll close my remarks on that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Miles Briggs seeks to withdraw Amendment 50. Does any member object? No member objects. So Amendment 50 is withdrawn. I call Amendment 3 in the name of Pam Gosal, already debated with Amendment 50. Pam Gosal, to move or not move?
Convener, happy not to move my amendment and take up the offer to work with the Minister for Stage 3. And I want to also thank the Minister for recognising all the great work that Emily Taste has done.
Thank you very much. I call Amendment 51 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 50. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Not move.
I call Amendment 52 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with Amendment 50. Maggie Chapman, to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 52 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are not agreed. There will be a division. Those in favour of Amendment 52? Those against Amendment 52? Okay. The result of the vote on Amendment 52 is yes 1, no 9. Amendment 52 is not agreed to. I call Amendment 53 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with Amendment 50. Maggie Chapman, to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 53 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We are not agreed. There will be a division. Those in favour of Amendment 53? And those against? Thank you. The result of the vote on Amendment 53 is yes 1, no 9. Amendment 53 is not agreed to. I call Amendment 54 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 50. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Not move.
I call Amendment 55 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 50. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Move.
The question is that Amendment 55 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are agreed. I call Amendment 56 in the name of Pam Duncan-Glancy, already debated with Amendment 50. Pam Duncan-Glancy, to move or not move?
Move.
The question is that Amendment 56 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
No.
We are not agreed. There will be a division. Those in favour of Amendment 56? And those against? Okay. The result of the vote on Amendment 56 is yes 4, no 6. Amendment 56 is not agreed to. I call Amendment 57 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with Amendment 50. Maggie Chapman, to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 58 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with Amendment 50. Maggie Chapman, to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 59 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with Amendment 50. Maggie Chapman, to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 60 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with Amendment 50. Maggie Chapman, to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 60 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 61 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 50. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Not move.
Okay, so I just want to check. We go to Amendment 62. Is that confirmed? Yes. I call Amendment 62 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 50. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Not move.
I call Amendment 63 in the name of Miles Briggs, already debated with Amendment 50. Miles Briggs, to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 64 in the name of Pam Duncan-Glancy, already debated with Amendment 50. Pam Duncan-Glancy, to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 64 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are agreed. I call Amendment 65 in the name of Pam Duncan-Glancy, already debated with Amendment 50. Pam Duncan-Glancy, to move or not move?
Move.
The question is that Amendment 65 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
No.
We are not agreed. There will be a division. Those in favour of Amendment 65? Okay. And those against? Thank you. The result of the vote on Amendment 65 is yes 4, no 6. Amendment 65 is therefore not agreed to. I call Amendment 66 in the name of Pam Duncan-Glancy, already debated with Amendment 50. Pam Duncan-Glancy, to move or not move?
Move.
The question is that Amendment 66 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are agreed. I call Amendment 67 in the name of Pam Duncan-Glancy, already debated with Amendment 50. Pam Duncan-Glancy, to move or not move?
Move.
The question is that Amendment 67 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
No.
We are not agreed. There will be a division. Those in favour of Amendment 67? Thank you. And those against? Thank you. Thank you very much. The result of the vote on Amendment 67 is yes 4, no 6. Amendment 67 is therefore not agreed to. I call Amendment 68 in the name of Pam Duncan-Glancy, already debated with Amendment 50. Pam Duncan-Glancy, to move or not move?
Move.
The question is that Amendment 68 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
No.
We are not agreed. There will be a division. Those in favour of Amendment 68? Thank you. And those against? Thank you. The result of the vote on Amendment 68 is yes 4, no 6. Amendment 68 is therefore not agreed to. And almost bang on our time of a suggested break at 11, we will suspend for 15 minutes before moving to section 3. Thank you very much. Okay, welcome back. I call Amendment 69 in the name of Ross Greer, group with Amendments 70, 71, 4, 72, 73, 74 and 75. Ross Greer to move Amendment 69 and speak to all amendments in the group. Mr Greer.
Thank you, Convener. You'll be glad to know my speaking notes in this group are far shorter than the last one. So Amendment 69 specifies that the terms and conditions that are applied to national training programmes may require, and emphasise may, require that a programme is to be delivered by an institution that has a recognised trade union, or trade unions plural. This amendment just ensures that trade union recognition is incorporated into the terms and conditions for national training programmes. The amendment provides some flexibility here to provide for NTP providers who are not technically an institution, so thus Scottish ministers may specify. So this way the amendment doesn't exclude organisations who are delivering training programmes who are not technically themselves institutions. I've also proposed may rather than must here for the additional reason that providers may not actually have an active staff union and shouldn't lose out because of that. The issue that I'm trying to get at here is where staff are trying to unionise and not being recognised by their employer, not where there's simply an absence of a union that the organisation should therefore then be precluded from providing training. So, similar to amendments in Group 4, the Government's own Fair Work Guidance does include a section on effective worker voice and conditionality in relation to the granting of public funds. This requires all organisations with a workforce to be able to demonstrate that all workers have access to effective voice channels at both collective and individual levels before the organisation itself is able to access grants. Unions are clearly the most effective manner through which workers can have their voice heard. So I think that requiring union recognition wherever a union exists would deliver on the government's own stated objectives. And to be clear here, what I'm trying to avoid in this situation is where public money is being given to organisations to provide training whilst that organisation is withholding recognition from union branches that exist. So Amendment 71 specifies that ministers must publish terms and conditions that they impose on NTPs, along with any reasons for considering them appropriate to impose, or if it's not appropriate to publish, that they should issue a statement of their reasons why. So, for example, if it gets into areas of commercial sensitivity. 75 adds a power of clawback for the SFC in relation to national training programmes if there's violations of agreed fair work principles. Via regulation, ministers would then have to set out further detail in relation to the repayment of funds, including notification requirements, process for appeal, issues like that, or details like that, I should say. A financial clawback, I don't think, and as I said a couple of times during Stage 1 proceedings, is the most effective method of sanction, but it is a tool that should be available to the SFC in all relevant circumstances, including when it comes to private providers. The existence of the power and a clear willingness to use it should act as a powerful enough deterrence in and of itself, and at the moment it does appear somewhat lopsided that the SFC have a power of clawback in relation to colleges and universities, but not so much when it relates to private training providers. Like my previous amendment, this just builds on the Government's Fair Work First guidance. It would ensure that anyone in receipt of public funding for the purposes of delivering national training programmes is adhering to existing government fair work policy by creating that option, that power of sanction, and the fact that the power exists should be in and of itself strong incentive to make sure that it isn't actually used. I note that Miles Briggs' Amendment 72 is in a pretty similar space, and whilst I'm obviously keen to see my 75 pass, given the detail that it would require ministers to set out, I'm very happy to see where the debate goes in respect of these, and I would hope that there is a broad consensus in this space, regardless of which of the amendments we choose to proceed with.
And can you move Amendment 69?
And I move Amendment 69.
Thank you very much. I call Miles Briggs to speak to Amendment 70 and other amendments in the group. Mr Briggs.
Thank you, Convener. And as Ross Greer has outlined, there's a bit of an overlap on many of these amendments, but my amendment seeks to ensure parity between conditions which will apply to those receiving grants for the purpose of a delivery of programmes of training for employment and those imposed on fundable bodies and regional strategic bodies in terms of repayment for sections 12A and 12B of the 2005 Act. And I think it is vital, as I've mentioned earlier, that we do make sure public money is not given without the ability to seek repayment and, where appropriate, interest if required. As has been touched on, the government already have a number of policies in place with relation to Fair Work First criteria, but my Amendment 74 would put that in, would clearly outline that in terms of terms and conditions imposed on the requirement for the provider to be compliant to that criteria, given the links to the government's policy in this regard. And so I move Amendment 70 in my name.
Thank you very much. I call the Minister, speak to Amendment 4 and other amendments in the group. Minister.
Thank you, Convener. My Amendment 4 concerns the funding of training providers and puts beyond doubt that they are not restricted from operating in a way which is commercially profitable, and the SFC's payments do not need to be only for directly reimbursing expenses. Excuse me. Private sector training providers who, as I emphasised earlier, do an important job in our system and in our economy, would be used to bring capacity and capability which is not available from colleges and universities as they currently do now. I am keen that the key role that they play in our skills landscape continues in the future. It is appropriate that commercial organisations can operate a business model which generates legitimate and proportionate profit, and I hope members will support it and support Amendment 4. Turning to the other amendments.
Amendment 4.
Yes. Pam Duncan-Glancy.
I thank the Minister for taking this intervention, and forgive me if I've misunderstood the wording in the amendment. But could the Minister set out, when the amendment says in respect of expenditure incurred or to be incurred by the person, can you explain a bit more about why that would be removed? Would it have implications for people, for example, who were relocating and making payments to individuals who were relocating as a result of a skills gap? How would that affect what we're doing in terms of encouraging people to move rurally if they're teachers, etc.? Or have I completely misunderstood the government's intention on the amendment?
Minister.
In terms of, just provide a bit more, if Pam Duncan-Glancy could just provide a bit more context to that, I'd be grateful.
So
Pam Duncan-Glancy.
Forgive me, Convener, thank you. It appears to be removing the ability to pay a person for particular skills and to access particular skills and education and learning. And I wondered if that would come up against any concerns about, for example, incentive schemes to move people to particular areas where there are skills shortages. So, for example, the teacher waiver scheme. So it was just for clarity as to whether or not it would affect that.
Minister.
Thank you for providing that additional context and for the intervention, Pam Duncan-Glancy. Just to be clear, I think there's perhaps a bit of a misunderstanding. The amendment intends just to make the power to pay more flexible. It is not about people, it's about companies and the situation regarding them. But thanks for seeking that clarity. If I can move to the other amendments in Group 5, Ross Greer's amendment 69 refers to an institution. Yet, unfortunately, it's not clear what this actually means, that term in the amendment. The persons delivering national training programmes may not be institutions, but could be any type of person. So attaching such a grant condition would be unhelpful in limiting who can provide training programmes solely to institutions. I thank Miles Briggs for setting out the rationale behind his amendments. However, I do think that Okay, I'll start again on that shortly and move back to Amendment 69 and take an amendment from
Ross Greer. I appreciate that, Minister. Just to clarify, is the government's objection to 69 a matter of drafting, or does the government object to the policy objective in relation to recognition of unions?
Minister.
So the consideration of trade unions, of course, is something throughout the Stage 2 process that we have paid careful attention to. This Amendment 69 is not, as I said, competently drafted. We could consider the matters raised within it in terms of trade unions further ahead of Stage 3, but at the moment I'm urging the committee not to back Amendment 69, indeed Ross Greer not to move it if he wishes. If I may move on, I thank Miles Briggs for setting out the rationale behind his amendments. However, I do think that the intention and wording of Amendment 70 is unclear. If he is suggesting that we should have a provision that effectively allows the grant funding to be passed directly on to employers rather than staying with within the SFC's direct oversight, I'm sure he can see how that might prove challenging if universally applied. However, this sort of national training programme might be a good idea in some circumstances, but I'm unsure if such provision is necessary, and don't consider the wording he gives. The wording here gives the intended effect. So I am happy, however, to consider the matter further ahead of stage 3 if he's minded to do that as well. I'm pleased to support Amendment 71 in the name of Ross Greer and Amendment 72 in the name of Miles Briggs. Amendment 71 brings transparency to the terms and conditions set by the Scottish Ministers when providing grant funding to the SFC. Amendment 72 implicitly emphasises the importance of compliance and results in return for public money by setting out how the SFC could impose repayment conditions. Whilst I have no issue whilst I have no issue with the spirit of Daniel Johnson's Amendment 73, it is problematic on several fronts. The words transparent on spend is not defined, and we would not want a grant recipient to need to publish details of all of their expenditure. This could be unnecessarily bureaucratic and sensitive in respect of certain matters such as staff salaries and subcontracting. But more importantly, by requiring the SFC to impose a condition that the person adopts fair work practices in all circumstances, regardless of the nature of the business, it has the effect, Amendment 73, of mandating employment terms and conditions, and this is strictly out with, unfortunately, the competence of this Parliament. And so there is an employment law reservation, and this amendment should not be supported. Miles Briggs's Amendment 74 is in similar terms, and although it is not framed as an essential grant condition, this amendment is unnecessary as the bill already gives the SFC a broad power to make grants subject to such terms and conditions as it, the SFC, considers is appropriate to impose. It is for the SFC to decide what grant condition may or may not be appropriate depending on the nature of the training programme and the grant recipient. But I appreciate the desire for legislation to expressly allow for the SFC to impose a condition in this space, and I'm happy to look at this further to ensure we have a provision that is workable and within legislative competence. I commit to doing so at stage 3, and I would therefore ask Miles Briggs not to press his Amendment 74. Likewise, Ross Greer's Amendment 75 makes provision which is more appropriately placed in the particular contract or offer of grant made to the person providing the national training programme. In addition, the purpose of the provision appears to be to financially penalise employers who do not adhere to fair work principles. This therefore relates to the reserved matter of employment rights and is outside legislative competence of this Parliament. I would therefore ask Mr Greer not to press Amendment 75, and if he does, I would urge members to vote against it. Convener, I move Amendment 4 in my name and ask members to support it. I hope members will also support Amendments 71 and 72. As stated, I cannot support Amendment 70 as currently drafted and would ask Miles Briggs not to press it and allow me to consider the matter further ahead of stage 3. But if he does press it, I would encourage members to vote against it. I'll take the amendments, the interventions.
Ross Greer.
Thanks. I'm grateful again to the Minister. And if Amendment 72 in Miles Briggs' name passes, I won't move 75. But on the Minister's point that these specific conditions around callback should be set out in the contracts between the SFC and the provider, could I just ask the Government why that hasn't been happening? Because my understanding is the SFC have never clawed money back, and there clearly have been occasions where there have been breaches of fair work practices. I'm just not aware of the SFC actually using the powers that it's got at present. Minister.
So there, and it relates to the point that the convener raised earlier at the beginning of the session, and I will happy to give an undertaking to write to committee in the weeks ahead on these points about the SFC accountability to ministers and the accountability the SFC applies out to others under the current 2005 Act, and of course that relates to the points we're considering today. I think There's certainly through the process of this bill an emphasis that's obviously been applied through the stage 2 process, but also through the engagement that ministers have had with the SFC and that others have had with the SFC to see the SFC to play a proactive role in these matters of fair work. And I'm sure the SFC have heard that through the process of today's proceedings and will, in good faith, take these points on board. If I may sum up, Convener. Sorry, Pam Dunn-Glancy, did you want to? Did you?
Can wait till
Okay. If I may sum up, Convener, just to re-emphasise, I cannot support Daniel Johnston's Amendment 73 and would encourage members to vote against it on the basis of the provision being out with the legislative competence of this Parliament. The same applies to Ross Greer's Amendment 75, although I note he said he won't be moving it. And I would ask Miles Briggs not to press his Amendment 74, but I would again offer to consider this ahead of Stage 3. Should he decide to press it, I would encourage members to vote against it. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. I call Pam Duncan-Glancy to speak to Amendment 73 in the name of Daniel Johnson and other amendments in the group. Ms Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you, Convener. Amendment 73 simply asserts that if public money goes to a private or an independent provider, we require value for money, fair work standards and transparency on spend. I don't think that, given that the government can consistently apply or do apply, there are examples of where the government do apply conditions of grant funding that do include fair work. I'm not sure that I consider that this would be out with legislative competence, given that it's about when the grant is given to the fundable body. Yes. Minister.
I think Pam Duncan-Glancy raises an important point there, and it relates to some other discussion through the course of this morning. There is a difference between grant funding conditions from a body and setting conditions in law which would breach the reservation in terms of employment law being firmly reserved to the UK Parliament. That's the difference.
Pam Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you for the intervention, Minister, and I appreciate that, and I heard that justification earlier. But the drafting of this amendment specifically says when making a grant to a person who is not a Scottish public authority, the Council must impose. Yes.
Minister.
I appreciate the drafting of the amendment. However, I need to emphasise that this is an amendment going into primary legislation, and that is why it would be out with the competence of the Scottish Parliament.
Pamela Duncan-Glancy.
I thank the member for taking that intervention. And I remain sceptical about whether or not, if I'm honest, that is the case. I've seen the government talk about their fair work principles in other spaces and in other areas. I've seen them assert that they can guarantee them in certain sectors. This appears to contradict that, which gives me some concern. But I think fundamentally what this amendment is trying to do is to make sure that we've got value for money. The fair work standards happen when we give fundable bodies any funding, public funding, and that they're transparent on spend. And if the Minister were able to potentially intervene in response, I'd be interested to know if the Minister agrees with the principle that value for money must be guarded, fair work standards must be guarded, and that transparency on spend must be guarded. Would he be willing to work ahead of Stage 3 to come up with an amendment that he considers within legislative competence?
Minister.
May I intervene? I am happy to, as always, have further engagement with Pam Duncan-Glancy, and in this instance, as in so many other instances, she is bringing amendments to Parliament that are in areas where we want to make difference in terms of social justice and delivery. I think we need to consider carefully the employment law reservation, as I've emphasised, and this is a primary legislative process, which is why I'm being so strong on this, because we cannot move beyond the legislative competence of this Parliament as an absolute necessity for all of us, and without meaning to be party political, but just as a statement of fact, the complication here is that employment law is not within the competence of this Parliament. But I'm happy to have further engagement. I'm not going to give an undertaking to necessarily bring forward a similar amendment in this space on these matters, but I'm happy to give an undertaking to be open-minded about having further engagement with the member on the points within on the wider issues within this amendment.
Hamdan Clancy.
I appreciate the Minister's clarification. I am left a bit in kind of unclear then as to the government's position on whether or not they think it would be important to require these things as a matter of law. What the government is proposing in this is the movement of funds, public funds, to organisations that I think all of us hope and believe will be providing value for money, will be supporting fair work principles, and will be transparent in how they use their funding. And we've heard that public sector institutions such as colleges are really, really keen that if those requirements are applied to them, then they should be applied elsewhere. I'm a bit concerned that the government isn't prepared to work on an amendment at stage 3 that would be within legislative competence if it considers that this isn't within legislative competence, because that leaves us in a position where we don't have those protections for that money in the legislation. And that I don't think is an acceptable circumstance to be left in. Happy.
Minister.
Thank you. Just to re-emphasise, I'm very happy to have further engagement because, like the member, of course, value for money, fair work practices and transparency as general principles are very important to the government. I'm just being cautious in terms of committing to a similar amendment because of the employment law reservation, which I have to be very, very strong on, because we cannot stray out with the competence of this Parliament. So, very happy to have further constructive dialogue, and I think the member and I are in alignment on the importance of the general principles of value for money, fair work practices and transparency in terms of the spending of public money. But we just need to be very careful about drafting and primary legislation.
Hamdan Clancy.
I appreciate that. Forgive me, Convener, for your patience on this as well. Just to press this particular issue ever so slightly further, a government being supportive of principles isn't the same as codifying them in a piece of legislation and requiring them. But I'm prepared to take the Minister at his word that he may look at other mechanisms by which that he could try and encourage that, enforce it, require it. Can I just check, though, that what's the Minister's view on the value for money aspect of this amendment and on the transparency on spend? Does the Minister think that those things are out with the competence of the Parliament, or is the Minister prepared in principle to look at an amendment that at least does those?
Minister.
I'm happy to have further engagement, but we just need to be very careful in the consideration, as I've emphasised already. I think we've covered this amendment's significance. I have no more to say. Thank you.
Hamdan Clancy.
I think we have probably covered it significantly, so with that I'll close. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call on Ross Greer to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 69.
Thank you, Convener. I'm not going to press Amendment 69 on the basis of what the Minister said. I'm happy to try and work with him ahead of Stage 3. I would suggest, though, with respect to the Minister, that it would be very helpful for the Government to come to these proceedings and be absolutely clear on where it agrees with the policy objective of an amendment and where it disagrees, because I can accept that members bring amendments that have deficient drafting. Resources available are limited. The legislation team do a fantastic amount of work, but they're doing a monumental amount of work on our behalf. It does very often feel like the government uses issues of drafting as an excuse to obscure the fact that it actually disagrees with the policy objective of particular amendments and simply doesn't want to put that on the record. It would be much more helpful for proceedings if the government could come and just be totally straightforward as to whether it agrees with the objective of an amendment or not, and therefore if it agrees with the objective but the wording is deficient, it's very clear that we can not press it at this stage, work ahead to something for Stage 3. I will move Amendment 71, grateful for the Minister's support to that. Hope that the committee will be agreeable to it. I expect Miles Briggs' Amendment 72 will pass, which makes my 75 unnecessary. And I'll just finish this group on picking up on the debate between the Minister and Pam Duncan-Glancy in particular around issues of competence and where putting particular conditions into legislation, in the Government's view, takes us beyond the competence of the Scottish Government. It does sound like the Government's position is that it's possible to achieve a lot of these objectives through policy decisions out with legislation, simply setting them as conditions of grants rather than putting that into legislation, and the issues of competence come to the fore when it is actually put in primary legislation. That to me is a perfectly respectable position if the government was actually putting these conditions into grant funding using its policy discretion. My frustration is that almost all the issues that we've been discussing today, really all the issues we've been discussing today, are not new. And we had, for example, before 2021, we had been told for around a decade that it was not possible for the Scottish Government to set conditions around procurement and grants in relation to the real living wage. And in 2021, the Minister's Party and mine, together in the September or the October, simply delivered that. And it turns out that it was possible to do it. I respect the Government's position that it doesn't want to put these issues into primary legislation because of the issues of competence and the risk that might then therefore pose to these bills as a whole. What I would say, though, is that the Government should then make maximum use of its existing powers to set these conditions directly as a matter of government policy rather than putting them into legislation. I think that would make it a much more defensible position when it comes to these proceedings to push back against amendments, because amending bills is really the only way that other members of this Parliament have the opportunity to influence these kind of policy decisions. If the Government were simply following through on the agenda that it allegedly believes in relation to Fair Work, then we wouldn't need to bring forward these amendments and test the legislative competence of the Parliament, because the Government would simply be getting on with setting those conditions in the first place. Yes.
Pamela King-Glancy.
I thank the member for that intervention, and I agree wholeheartedly with what he's saying. Would he agree with me then that it would be important for the Government to take the first opportunity that it can to set out its policy intention on fair work in this space, ahead of, or at least around the stage 3 of this piece of legislation?
Ross Greer.
I absolutely agree with that. I think it is essential, particularly if, quite frankly, if the Government doesn't want to be placed in the position of voting against policy objectives that it allegedly supports at stage 3. I'm sure opposition members would be quite amenable and understanding in relation to simply not bringing those amendments forward if the Government had made a clear statement of its intent to deliver on those objectives through other means. That absolutely requires a clear statement from the Government ahead of stage 3 proceedings, covering a lot of the issues that have been raised today and that were raised during the stage 1 debate. But I'll finish there, Convener.
Thank you very much. Ross Greer seeks to withdraw Amendment 69. Does any member object? No member objects. Amendment 69 is withdrawn. I call Amendment 70 in the name of Miles Briggs, already debated with Amendment 69. Miles Briggs to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 71 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 69. Ross Greer to move or not move?
Move.
The question is that Amendment 71 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 4 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 69. Minister to move formally.
Formally moved.
The question is that Amendment 4 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 72 in the name of Miles Briggs, already debated with Amendment 69. Miles Briggs to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 72 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. I call Amendment 73 in the name of Daniel Johnson, already debated with Amendment 69. Pam Duncan-Glancy to move or not move?
On the basis of the discussion just had, I won't move at this point.
Thank you. I call Amendment 74 in the name of Miles Briggs, already debated with Amendment 69. Miles Briggs to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 75 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 69. Ross Greer to move or not move?
Not moved.
The question is Section 3 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 26 in the name of Willie Rennie, group with amendments as shown in the groupings. I point out that if Amendment 26 is agreed to, I cannot call Amendments 76, 77 and 78 due to a preemption, and I call Willie Rennie to move Amendment 26 and speak to all amendments in the group. Mr Rennie.
Thanks very much, Convener. My 3 amendments in this group, 26, 27, 28, revolve around 2 central points. One is that an apprentice should be employed. It should be an occupation. And secondly, with 27, it's referring to, rather than receiving training, it's achieve the competence required. And there are important, significant differences. And I think the concern around these amendments is the desire to protect the credibility of apprenticeships by making sure they don't stray into the space of simply training, but are actually an apprenticeship with that important relationship between the employer and employee built into the system. Because being part of a team following the disciplines of the workplace, being important to the integrity of the organisation, of the company, and their success is part of that whole experience. And if, for instance, there is block training or to have programme-led models, they involve quite significant periods outside the workplace, so therefore disrupt that kind of learning, that opportunity to understand a business environment or a working environment, but also have an impact on the logistics of that organisation, that company, that employer, involving pulling in other members of staff to fill in those gaps. Yes, certainly.
Pam Duncan-Glancy.
I thank the member for taking the intervention. The member will know that his Amendment 26 preempts one of mine further, which will of course affect voting. But can the member set out how that would impact on foundation apprenticeships and whether young people undertaking foundation apprenticeships should be considered employed?
Willie Rennie.
So the foundation apprenticeships are catered for separately, as in work-based learning rather than the apprenticeship grouping. So this would obviously not affect that. But it's important for the other apprenticeships to have embedded within them that employment status. But secondly, the issue around about whether it's something that has been, rather than receiving training, they have got to achieve the competence, which again reinforces the integrity of the apprenticeship model. So rather than just completing the course, they have to achieve a competence, which again makes sure that the standard that is perceived of the apprenticeship is maintained. So there's also a reference in 28 to the Employment Rights Act of 1996 and the Scottish Government's Fair Work First policy, which is an integral part of the employment status that is proposed within these amendments. It should be built in. So with that, I will conclude for now. Oh, yes, I'm taking it.
Ross Greer.
I'm very grateful, and I do have some sympathy to what he's trying to achieve. I have a slight issue with the wording in Amendment 27. I was just wondering if he could explain it a bit, because believe it or not, buried deep down within me, there is a little bit of a liberal, and the liberal within me is just a bit uncomfortable at the mention of behaviours in the workplace here. Like, yes, we expect all staff in a workplace to behave to a certain standard. I'm just a bit uncomfortable putting into legislation that would be part of what we require of apprentices. It feels just a bit too specific to me, and I'm just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on what is meant by that, because I feel we're getting into very intrusive territory when we're specifying the behaviours of individuals.
Willie Rennie.
What I would interpret this section to be around is the ability to turn up, to take orders, to follow the conduct of the organisation, in addition to the skills that are achieved. Now, you could argue that the skills, that's part of the skill set, but I think it's worth drawing it out to make sure, because that's the particular benefit of an apprenticeship, is that relationship with your supervisor, your manager, your employer is really, really important part of them understanding what the future workplace is like, and that's what differentiates them from other forms of learning. And that's why I think in behaviour, maybe it's the disciplinarian coming out in me, but the behaviour is an important part of that experience, and that's why I think it should be specifically referenced. Okay.
Can you move Amendment 26?
Yeah, I'll move Amendment 26.
Thank you. I call Pam Duncan-Glancy to speak to Amendment 76 and other amendments in the group. Ms Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you, Convener. I'm going to start, if it's all right, with number 82, and I will move Amendment 76 for procedural purposes. Amendment 82 defines foundation apprenticeships as Scottish apprenticeships delivered as part of the senior phase education pathway, delivered in partnership with local authorities, schools, colleges of further education and employers. Members will be aware about the evidence that we took on the bill and concerns, including from ADES and local authorities and others, that the foundation apprenticeships weren't significantly addressed within the bill, and it was considered a bit of an omission that they weren't. On that basis, I seek to address that omission and have defined foundation apprenticeships in the bill. Amendment 81 is the paving amendment for the definition of foundation apprenticeships. And Amendment 76 makes clear that foundation apprenticeships and apprentices doing them are not employed to also address the point I made to Willie Rennie. Amendment 92 says the Scottish Funding Council must ensure that foundation apprenticeships are delivered by in partnerships with local authorities, and that there should be a report on uptake, including looking at who is accessing them, whether the person and people have any disability, which region they're accessing them in, and a report on the index of multiple deprivation, so that we can have a clear understanding of the way in which people are accessing foundation apprenticeships, including the demographics of the people who are accessing them, so that we can ensure that all young people access the opportunities that are available through foundation apprenticeships. On a couple of other amendments in this group, happy.
Ross Greer.
I'm very grateful, and I understand and sympathise with why she's keen to see a clearer definition of foundation apprenticeships. I suppose I'm wondering if she shares my concern that defining one particular apprenticeship, or take on board that it's foundation apprenticeships are almost not apprenticeships insofar as what we've just been discussing with Willie Rennie's amendments, but defining one particular kind of apprenticeship here would make it challenging in future if we were to undergo any reforms to the system, because once we put this into primary legislation, if we in a couple of years' time decide that we actually want to make substantial changes, or even something like renaming, I don't think they should be called foundation apprenticeships. I think foundation is an unhelpful term harking back to the era of standard grades. We would then need to open up primary legislation again to do that. Would she recognise that concern? And is there perhaps a way that ministerial regulation making power could be included here as well, to ensure that we wouldn't need to go through a primary legislative process if we needed to make adaptations, even minor adaptations to this at some point in the future?
Pam Duncan-Glancy.
I thank the member for the intervention, and he makes a good point, in particular about the naming of foundation apprenticeships. I think that is important. I think not having it in this legislation, though, really is an omission, and we could end up in a situation where those apprenticeships and courses have been identified by experts, the OECD and others, as a really key part of our offer in Scotland in terms of apprenticeships, and so I would be nervous as to not mention them at all in the bill. But there is, I suppose, potential, should it pass at this point, that at stage 3 we could add a regulating making power for renaming any apprenticeships or for renaming them in the way that the member suggests. So I don't think supporting these amendments at this stage would entirely prevent the point around the ease of renaming it in primary legislation and therefore putting a regulating making power in at stage 3. I think that could still happen, and I hope that on that basis members will be able to support the amendments. Amendment 80, in the name of Stephen Kerr, seeks to address issues highlighted in evidence whereby witnesses have stressed the need to protect the training provider and college and the college relationship too. And I think these are incredibly important. I appreciate that these haven't been spoken to yet. But I just have some concern around the creation of a contractual relationship between the apprentice and the college. And I think I wonder if it could create some issues through various different liabilities. But I'll look forward to hearing the members' rationale for that particular amendment. And Amendment 6, in the Minister's name, specifies who ministers consult, but I note that it doesn't include apprentices specifically. And so I wonder, or indeed trade unions, and so I wonder whether the Minister would be willing to either tidy it and bring it back at stage 3, or whether he could set out on the record just now that he is clear that both apprentices and trade unions should be consulted in relation to his amendment, Amendment 6. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. I call Miles Briggs to speak to Amendment 77 and other amendments in the group. Mr Briggs.
Thank you, Convener. And as Ross Greer outlined earlier, I think the time we've had and the gap between laying amendments and being able to work with government to get that detail is why these are very much a set of probing amendments which I brought forward, and I'll speak to Stephen Kerr's amendments as well. So my amendments 77, 78 and 83. Amendment 77 deletes broadens the definition, so that an apprentice does not need to be receiving wages or other reward in order to fall within the definition. And Amendment 78 updates Section 12E so that the Scottish apprenticeship must involve an apprentice working for reward under a contract of employment, and it tightens the definition by making clear that in addition to being paid, the apprentice must be formally employed under the employment contract with an employer. I brought forward these amendments because I feel the bill should be an opportunity to update the standing of apprenticeships, but would be open to working with ministers to strengthen these. Amendment 83 in this group adds a new subsection making clear that the Scottish apprenticeship can include school-based apprenticeships, and it states the Scottish apprenticeship may include those delivered as part of school education, incorporating industry standards, Scottish vocational qualifications and workplace placements. And I think that's important to seek clarity within the bill around foundation apprenticeships, what that looks like. And I'm attempting to address the issues of delivering those within a school setting. There's been many conversations around the school college partnerships, which are really positive and developing, and I don't think that's necessarily captured within this bill. So I hope it's an opportunity to work with government to take forward some work in this area to recognise how apprenticeships are changing and how and where they may be delivered. Moving to Amendments 80 and 79, and I'm speaking to those lodged by my colleague Stephen Kerr. These amendments concern the very heart of the apprenticeship system, the definition of what a Scottish apprenticeship is. If that definition is vague or incomplete, then everything that follows from funding to quality assurance to the integrity of the apprenticeship brand in Scotland stands on uncertain ground. And these amendments are designed to put that right. The first point to be made, Convener, is that the bill, as introduced, offers only the barest sketch of what constitutes an apprenticeship. It notes that the apprenticeship involves learning and work-based experience, but it does not give Parliament, providers or employers any meaningful assurance about the structure, the purpose or integrity of that experience. And in a country where apprenticeships have become a vital route now to skilled employment, an essential pillar of the productivity agenda, such a loosely drawn definition is inadequate. So Amendment 80, and I hope this answers Pam Duncan-Glancy's ask for clarification, strengthens the definition by making it clear that the Scottish apprenticeship is a structured programme consisting of a coherent framework of learning and work-based experiences, which leads to a recognised qualification. This is not merely a tidying up exercise, it addresses a real and long-standing concern amongst employers that the term apprenticeship risks being diluted unless it's explicitly tied and recognised to quality-assured outcomes. And Stephen Kerr has consistently, as members will know, argued for a system that enhances, not erodes, the reputation of apprenticeships in Scotland. Amendment 80, therefore, gives legislative expression to that argument. This amendment also reflects the experience of employers, which I think we need to really recognise, and the training providers who've said repeatedly that clarity is critical. When businesses take on apprenticeships, they need to know that the programme has rigour, that it leads to a qualification of value, and that the term apprenticeship is not being implied inconsistently across different sectors and providers. And Amendment 80 brings that clarification. It articulates essential elements that give apprenticeships their standing, structure, and recognise learning, work-based competence, and a qualification that is meaningful in our labour market. Amendment 79 complements this by addressing the purpose of apprenticeship systems itself. It requires that the definition of a Scottish apprenticeship must reflect the needs of the Scottish economy and the opportunities available to our workforce. And this is a core point in all of the Scottish Conservatives' contributions on tertiary reform. Apprenticeships are not an abstract educational exercise. They exist to prepare people for the jobs of tomorrow, the productive and skilled employment that contributes to all our national prosperity. If the definition is stretched from that purpose, then the risk creating a system that is technically correct but strategically aimless. By linking the definition to Scotland's economic needs, Amendment 79 ensures that apprenticeships remain a living, responsive part of the labour market. It recognises economic changes as well as technological advances as industries evolve, as new sectors emerge, and that the apprenticeship system must be capable of adapting to new opportunities. Without this amendment, the definition is strategic at the very moment when Scotland's skills system needs to be dynamic. Taken together, Amendments 80 and 79 offer a coherent improvement to the bill. They ensure that when we speak of a Scottish apprenticeship, we're speaking of something with definition, credibility, purpose and economic relevance. They align with the principle that the Scottish Conservatives have repeatedly articulated throughout this process, that apprenticeships must command the confidence not only of learners but employers alike, and must be designed to serve Scotland's long-term productivity and prosperity. Convener, if the bill is to act as a safeguard and strengthen the apprenticeship brand, then these amendments are, I believe, helpful. They provide clarity and strengthen the bill, and I invite colleagues to support Amendments 80 and 79 in the name of my colleague Stephen Kerr, and I move Amendment 77 in my name.
Thank you. I call on the Minister to speak to Amendment 5 and other amendments in the group. Minister.
Thank you, Convener. These amendments, as has been discussed, all relate to the definition of Scottish apprenticeships. And before I get into the detail of the amendments, there are just a couple of general points I would like to make for wider context that I think are helpful. In developing the bill, the Government engaged in detailed discussions with the SFC, SDS and the SAB Short Life Working Group on the definition of apprenticeships. At this point, I would like to record my thanks to SAB for very detailed, constructive and helpful engagement. These discussions cautioned against using particular terms in the bill: modern, foundation and graduate apprenticeships. The caution was to allow for future evolution of Scottish apprenticeships. Secondly, the bill gives ministers the power to amend the definition of Scottish apprenticeship by affirmative regulation. This, of course, means that any change would be subject to extensive consultation, and the Parliament would scrutinise any proposed changes. We absolutely need to monitor the effect of the definition in implementation and ensure that it is working for everyone. So there are a few amendments in this group, and I will turn to them thematically. Starting with my own Amendment 5, which, as has been stated, introduces a requirement for Scottish Minister to consult various stakeholders and groups before making regulations that amend the definition of Scottish apprenticeships. I know from my own engagement with employers and business groups that I referred to earlier that they are keen to be closely involved in any development in this area, and rightly so. This amendment would mean that there will be a statutory duty to consult those who play a key role in delivering apprenticeships, such as employers and training providers. I note Pam Duncan-Glancy's points to this Amendment 5, not Amendment 6, to this Amendment 5. And I would just say that subsection E, any other persons as Scottish ministers consider appropriate, would cover potentially the groups that Pam Duncan-Glancy mentions. I'm happy to give way to Pam Duncan.
Pam Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you, Convener. And the point at which I made the intervention was to apologise for getting the number wrong. The Minister is, of course, correct. It's Amendment 5, not Amendment 6, which is in the next group, which I think I have a similar concern with, but we can come to that. I take the point about subsection E, such other persons as the Minister considers appropriate. But what happens in a situation where the Minister didn't consider that it was appropriate to consult apprentices or trade unions? And can the Minister set out why he considers it appropriate to name the SFC, employers, education bodies and training providers in legislation, but not apprentices or trade unions?
Minister.
So I take the points that Pam Duncan-Glancy has made on the record through the deliberations on these amendments, and we'll continue to consider them. Our main aspirations was to make sure that we didn't have a long list of all the different engagement that there may or may need to be, may or may not need to be. So to have a subsection 5E position allows for those other stakeholders that would appropriately be involved in such considerations to be involved. So Yes. Yeah.
Pam Duncan Glancy.
I thank the Minister for his patience and for taking the intervention. And I take the point. I think we are only looking at 2 additions, but can the Minister set out why apprentices and trade unions didn't make it on, but the other 4 did?
There wasn't a specific. There wasn't a specific deliberate exclusion. The inclusion of those that are listed in through Amendment 5 in subsection 2A, A to D, was to emphasise the importance of what they would bring to the considerations. But again, there was no intentional exclusion of the groups that Pam Duncan Glancy highlights, or any others. I take the points that have been made on the record, and we'll consider them further. So I thank Pam Duncan Glancy for raising them. And as I've emphasised throughout consideration of this bill, the views of trade unions and, of course, whether it's apprentices or those who are being educated in our wider higher and further education programmes and courses, their views are, of course, absolutely vital and significant. So if I may move on. So moving to Stephen Kerr's amendments 79 and 80, which seek to add other parties such as colleges and training providers to the apprenticeship agreement. Provisions in the bill do not require a tripartite agreement, but also do not preclude one. And I would hope that reassurance is helpful for members, including Miles Briggs, on behalf of Stephen Kerr, and ask him not to press Amendment 80. I am happy to support the Amendment 79, though. It's worth remembering that colleges can be training providers, so Amendment 79 is sufficient. This amendment also allows flexibility for future innovation where there could be several training providers involved. So I'm grateful to Stephen Kerr for introducing this to the bill, and for Miles Briggs bringing it today on his behalf. Amendment 26 from Willie Rennie and Amendment 78 from Miles Briggs seek to require the apprentice to be under a contract of employment. And while we would expect that the vast majority of apprentices will be under a contract of employment, the bill as introduced includes a carefully framed definition that does not exclude any arrangements that would otherwise come within an apprenticeship. We want to allow for apprenticeships for office holders and other persons who are appointed or sponsored rather than formally employed, such as, for example, clergy persons, as happens in England. There are also a wealth of possible scenarios where we do not want to limit future innovation. And I also need to emphasise that apprentices are given the full protections of an employee in terms of the Employment Rights Act. And so these amendments 26 and 78, while with respect to colleagues, are not necessary, they are unnecessary and could potentially be limiting. And on that basis, the government does not support them, and I would be grateful if members did not press them, as I said, because they are not necessary, and if pressed, I would urge committee to respectfully reject them. Amendment 76, in the name of Pam Duncan Glancy, seeks to add foundation apprenticeships in the definition of Scottish apprenticeships. So, as I said in my opening remarks, in terms of engagement with SAB, while of course in the bill we are seeking to create a definition of Scottish apprenticeships, in terms of foundation, graduate and modern apprenticeships, there was a determination not to specifically define these. In terms of what the engagement with SFC, SDS and the SAB Short Life Working Group fed back to us. Yes, Miles Briggs.
Miles Briggs.
Thank you. Convener, I hear what the Minister has to say. I think for a lot of employers, though, they have become very much used to these terms. They understand where an apprentice is. In fact, some of the asks have been around the potential to develop a degree apprenticeship, not to remove the terminology. And I just wondered if the government have reflected on that, because I am worried it might be lost in translation if the government don't look towards what is now a defined set of apprenticeship terms from foundation to modern to graduate, and an aspiration for a degree apprenticeship to come out in the future of this as well. Minister.
I'll reflect on some of that shortly, if that's okay. Thanks to Miles Briggs for raising that. As I said, Amendment 76, in the name of Pam Duncan Glancy, seeks to add foundation apprenticeships into the definition of Scottish apprenticeships. The bill has separate provisions for work-based learning, which will allow for current arrangements for foundation apprenticeships to continue, and we want them to continue as a government. When taken with Jackie Dunbar's Amendment 10, which we are to consider later, so that's important in our considerations here too. It's important to consider that several employers and others, and I can think of, for example, some head teachers in my constituency, do not like the term foundation apprenticeship, even though they're very supportive of foundation apprenticeships and what they deliver. It's the term is something that many people do not like, because school pupils are not in a contract of employment or for other reasons, and it can be perceived as devaluing apprenticeships. Notwithstanding the value of foundation apprenticeships for what they achieve and what they do, is the term where there's some contention and deliberation. This is one reason why we were careful not to use the term in the bill. I can assure Pam Duncan Glancy that foundation apprenticeships are provided for by our new definition of work-based learning, and I hope this is sufficient for her not to press her amendment. Should she do so, I would encourage members to vote against Amendment 76. Miles Briggs's Amendment 77 appears to be removing the requirement that an apprentice works for a reward, which is not consistent with how the rest of the provisions define apprenticeships. The definition of apprenticeships in the bill requires that the apprentice work for rewards, so that voluntary work is excluded, and this is to seek to protect apprentices. The bill also requires that the apprentice works for another person for reward, which excludes self-employed people. In the case of self-employed individuals, there is no obvious way to overcome the fact that the employer is also the employee and apprentice, and this creates a barrier to ensuring adherence to the standards and quality requirements. The employee, employer and learning provider relationship is central to ensuring quality and standards are maintained. And for these reasons, I do not support Amendment 77 and would ask the committee to vote against this amendment if pressed. Amendment 27 from Willie Rennie seeks to require the apprentice to achieve the competence required by employers. As has been highlighted through the debate by other members, this is potentially problematic. Whether or not the apprentice is successful in achieving the competence required is most likely not knowable until near or at the end of the apprenticeship. Furthermore, an apprenticeship is still an apprenticeship even if it ultimately the individual fails to gain the competence. Therefore, with respect, we do not support the amendment and ask committee to vote against it should it be pressed by Willie Rennie. Amendments 28, 91 and 91A cannot be taken forward due to the reservation of employment law. In any event, the apprenticeship agreement addresses how training requirements are to be met and is a separate matter from the particulars of employment, which are protected by the Employment Rights Act and national minimum wage legislation. I have already explained that foundation apprenticeships are caught by the definition of work-based learning in the bill, and so I cannot support Miles Briggs's Amendment 83, and I hope that he accepts the explanation given earlier and will not press this amendment. With regard to Pam Duncan Glancy's Amendment 92, the 2005 Act, as amended by the bill, already requires the SFC to collaborate with local authorities on the exercise of their functions through Section 22. Pam Duncan Glancy's amendment also makes provision for reporting to the Scottish Parliament on an annual basis. And while I think she makes a good point about the importance of clear and transparent reporting on apprenticeship delivery, I would suggest that this approach should be taken holistically across Scottish apprenticeships and work-based learning. And this is something I would like to consider further for Stage 3 to bring back a coherent and cohesive approach to reporting on key measures in the bill, including this one. And I therefore ask her not to press Amendment 92, but should she do so, I would encourage members to vote against it. I do ask members to, of course, vote for my Amendment 5 and Stephen Kerr's Amendment 79. However, to summarise, I cannot support any of the other amendments in this group, and I hope I've explained why not, respectfully, to allow members not to press them. Should any do so, I would encourage the committee to vote against them as I have set out. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. I call Ross Greer to speak to Amendment 91 and other amendments in the group. Mr Greer.
Thank you, Convener. In a lot of ways, this amendment, while sitting in this group, is very much connected to the debates that I think we've now quite thoroughly rehearsed in relation to conditionality, areas of reservation versus where we can stretch devolution, conditionality, etc. So I'll just briefly summarise it, but I'm not going to go into the level of depth previously because I think we've rehearsed a lot of the underlying arguments here. But Amendment 91 adds that ministers must by regulation specify the minimum rate of pay for a Scottish apprentice, and that would be subject to the negative procedure. 91A builds on that by specifying that the rate of pay must not be less than the national minimum wage. I brought these forward because I think we all recognise the value of apprenticeships, fantastic way to kickstart careers, but that they're also vastly underpaid a lot of the time, meaning that many people just can't afford to go down that path, even if they want to. And the purpose of this amendment is to align the minimum wage payable to apprentices through the funding provided by the Scottish Government, through funding provided by the SFC, with the wider national minimum wage. So at the end of June, there was about just under 12,000 modern apprentices in Scotland in their first year of training, and about 6,000 of those were 19 or over. So if Amendments 91, 91A and 93 were to pass, those apprentices and every subsequent first-year apprentice would then be entitled to the minimum wage for their relevant age group. So for the 6,000 first-year apprentices this year, that would be a pay uplift of just under 50%. And bringing apprenticeship wages in line with the existing national minimum wage would end what I think many of us see as the injustice that sees apprentices paid less than the minimum wage of other workers of the same age as them, despite the fact that their bills and other expenses clearly aren't less than anyone else's just because their wages are. Amendment 93 is consequential. It removes Scottish apprentices from the national minimum wage regulations of 2015. So this is an area where, even under devolution, we are actually able to make variances, as is the case by the fact that Scottish apprentices are currently in that regulation from 2015. Amendment 93 would specify that the regulation doesn't apply to Scottish apprenticeships as defined by Section 12E in the 2005 Act. I've already rehearsed the reasons why I think getting into areas of conditionality in relation to wages is possible. Obviously, we've had that argument already with the government. I definitely understand the government's position. I am disappointed by the lack of willingness from the government to either test the limits in terms of legislative competence or to use non-legislative policy setting powers to try and raise standards in this sector. So I won't be moving and I won't be pressing these amendments to a vote at this stage, but I would be keen to engage with the Minister ahead of Stage 3, particularly on the points that we've already discussed with Pam Duncan-Glancy about a clear statement from the government ahead of Stage 3 on its wider approach to fair work in this sector and what other levers it intends to use to turn its policy aspirations into reality. I think the lack of action in non-legislative, using non-legislative mechanisms from the government is the reason why so many of these amendments have been brought forward.
Member take an intervention
yes.
on that point.
Miles Briggs.
Respect for the principles behind what he's trying to bring forward in these amendments. One of the things which has been consistently raised is actually transport costs for students. Now, free bus pass, I'm sure he will raise when he responds to me, but at the same time, for a lot of students in rural Scotland, that is just not an option. And I met a student on Monday who has £120 a week to travel from rural Perthshire to do her course in Dundee. So I take on board what he's trying to pursue, but there seems to be a wider issue here about the package of support for students to access training, especially those from rural communities.
Ross Greer.
I would agree with that, absolutely. And of course, the member is right to predict that I would talk up the advantages of free bus travel for people under the age of 22. And I think we should look at further expansion of that, and not necessarily based on age. There may be there is a compelling case, for example, to expand concessionary travel to those who perhaps are undertaking an apprenticeship, to recognise the fact that, as is the government's position, if we're not able to boost their wages, then perhaps there are other targeted measures that we can take that are clearly within the competence of this Parliament and government that would reduce some of the cost barriers that they face. Because given just how low the apprentice wage actually is, it simply makes it a non-viable option for a number of people, particularly in rural areas where costs like transport are so much higher. And I think that would be exactly the kind of conversation I would be keen, and I expect other members would be keen to have with the Minister ahead of stage 3, if the government is keen to avoid many of these amendments being brought back and rehearsed in the chamber at that point.
Thank you very much. I point out that if Amendment 26 is agreed to, I cannot call Amendments 76, 77 and 78 due to a pre-emption. Willie Rennie to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 26. Mr Rennie.
I understand the Minister's explanation, and I'm grateful for him providing the detailed explanation that he has. I do understand the desire to have flexibility in the definitions, but it is quite a rare opportunity for us to try and influence the shape of apprenticeships as a whole. And there is a concern among some that the exemptions that can be permitted within that flexibility would involve a dilution of the value of the credibility of apprenticeships. So I fully accept the roundabout, for instance, the rather strange one of around about the clergy. I think I do understand the wider principle of being able to have that, but I hope the Minister, perhaps in an intervention, would express a desire for that to be a very small exception, and the bulk of it would be directly employed in the traditional way. But also, he'd never made any reference to the concern around block release and programme-led learning, because there is a concern among some employers that large block release apprenticeship models involve that individual being removed from the workplace for a long period of time. So it disrupts their interaction with other employees and the system, and also, so therefore they lose the value of that involvement. But also the employer, the company, the business has a difficulty in filling that space for that protracted period of time. So I would wonder if the Minister would maybe intervene on that point.
Minister.
I thank Willie Rennie for the opportunity to intervene. And so in terms of the key points raised around avoiding unsatisfactory training arrangements, and also what he and also SAB have raised in terms of concerns about block release, this is something for the frameworks as well as for consideration here. And I appreciate the point that he made around that while we need to keep openness and flexibility for certain circumstances, and I appreciate the example I gave was quite I was going to say an unusual one, but let's say quite a niche one. But we do want to keep that flexibility and openness and transparency, and there is the consideration in the frameworks. What I would like to do is give an undertaking to have further dialogue with Mr Rennie on these points, and while I stand by the need for flexibility and to make sure that we allow for room for innovation, we're both aligned on the need for high standards and the need for good delivery. So if I can have further dialogue with Mr Rennie ahead of stage 3, I'd be grateful for that.
It probably does emphasise my amendment 24, which I didn't press, around about an industry-led body, to make sure that those views are fully and properly reflected in those discussions, which I accept is probably the more appropriate place for them to be had. But I think having that critical central role of employers, I think, would help to address those points. I'm slightly concerned around about the competence versus received training point, because even if an individual, the apprentice, doesn't actually achieve the competence, they're still classed as having gone through an apprenticeship. I think that devalues the role of an apprenticeship, and I'm sure it's long-standing practice. But I think it's important that every employer who sees that somebody's gone through an apprenticeship fully understands that they've achieved the competence, not just turned up. And I think that's an important point that I hope is reflected in the frameworks as we progress. And then the final point with Pam Duncan-Glancy's desire to seek a definition around about foundation apprenticeships. I think the Minister's arguments are the right ones. I am desperate to improve the parity of esteem between vocational and academic. I think foundation apprenticeships play an important role in introducing young people into that world, that credible world of apprenticeships. It's almost a gateway to the modern apprenticeship and others. But equally, there is a concern that if you call them apprenticeships, as the Minister outlined, that perhaps that devalues the role of or the credibility of apprenticeships in the wider family. So I think allowing it to be defined in the work-based approach is the right one to progress with. And I have noticed in recent years an increase in, for instance, placements from young people within employers, which I think is a good opportunity for them to experience the wider world of work. And I would like to encourage more of that. But that work-based learning, I think, is perhaps the right umbrella for that definition. So, yes, certainly.
Pam Duncan-Glancy.
I appreciate the member taking the intervention. Without defining foundation apprenticeships in the legislation, and I understand concerns about the name. I think the Minister was set out earlier there are regulated making powers to change names, but also my other concern about not having foundation apprenticeships on the bill is that there may not be a mechanism for the SFC to provide funding to local authorities or schools to continue to do such apprenticeships. Does the member share that concern?
I mean, I think the Minister's made it pretty clear that he's a strong supporter of foundation apprenticeships, and I'm sure everybody who provides that within the educational world will have heard that commitment. I think when there's such an active debate around about work-based learning in schools and also of foundation apprenticeships, I think it probably wouldn't be right to put it on the face of the bill. That wouldn't prevent us perhaps from revisiting a future stage once that debate is settled. But I think it's important that you value work-based learning, but we allow a degree of flexibility for that debate to continue, would be my argument. And on that, I will conclude unless anybody else is going to intervene, and I will not move Amendment 26.
Willie Rennie seeks to withdraw Amendment 26. Does any member object? No member objects. Amendment 26 is withdrawn. I call Amendment 76 in the name of Pam Duncan-Glancy, already debated with Amendment 26. Pam Duncan-Glancy, to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 76 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We are not agreed. There will be a division. Those in favour of Amendment 76? And those against Amendment 76? Thank you. The result of the vote on Amendment 76 is yes 1, no 9. Amendment 76 is therefore not agreed to. I call Amendment 77 in the name of Miles Briggs, already debated with Amendment 26. Miles Briggs, to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 78 in the name of Miles Briggs, already debated with Amendment 26. Miles Briggs, to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 27 in the name of Willie Rennie, already debated with Amendment 26. Willie Rennie, to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 28 in the name of Willie Rennie, already debated with Amendment 26. Willie Rennie, to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 80 in the name of Stephen Kerr, already debated with Amendment 26. Miles Briggs, to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 80 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We are not agreed. There will be a division. Those in favour of Amendment 80? And those against? Thank you very much. The result of the vote on Amendment 80 is yes 3, no 7. Amendment 80 is therefore not agreed to. I call Amendment 79 in the name of Stephen Kerr, already debated with Amendment 26. Miles Briggs, to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 79 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 5 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 26. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 5 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 81 in the name of Pam Duncan-Glancy, already debated with Amendment 26. Pam Duncan-Glancy to move or not move.
It moved.
The question is that Amendment 81 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We're not agreed. There will be a division. Those in favour of Amendment 81. And those against? Thank you. The result of the vote on Amendment 81 is yes 3, no 7. Amendment 81 is not agreed to. I call Amendment 82 in the name of Pam Duncan-Glancy, already debated with Amendment 26. Pam Duncan-Glancy to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 83 in the name of Miles Briggs, already debated with Amendment 26. Miles Briggs to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. We move on, and I call Amendment 6 in the name of the Minister, grouped with amendments as shown in the groupings. Minister to move Amendment 6 and speak to all amendments in the group. Minister.
Thank you, Convener. Employers have a critical role, as I've emphasised already, in the development of apprenticeship frameworks, and we want them to play that role. And I want to make that clear in the legislation. Therefore, Amendments 6 and 7 seek to achieve this. And I hope also that they demonstrate I have spent time since becoming Minister listening carefully to the views of business and employers in relation to this bill and seeking to act upon them. These amendments 6 and 7 require the SFC to have regard to the views of employers when preparing apprenticeship frameworks and before amending or revoking an apprenticeship framework. The SFC is required to have regard and rather than to consult employers, because it is expected that in many cases the SFC will already be very familiar with the views of employers from the Apprenticeship Committee and regular and extensive engagement. Where it does not already have that information, the SFC will need to seek out the views of employers in whatever way is appropriate, and consultation will, of course, continue to be one such way. Amendment 8 is a technical, consequential amendment. I also welcome that Willie Rennie wishes to see a formal role for employers in this process, and I will listen to his arguments for his Amendment 29. But I hope that he may consider that my Amendments 6 and 7 have largely the same effect. The same applies to Ross Greer's Amendment 86. And I will now take an intervention.
Pam Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you, Convener. Thank you, Minister, for taking my intervention. And I hadn't meant to cut you off mid-flow. I thought you were moving on to another amendment. Amendments 6 and 7 I have the same concerns about them as I did about Amendment 5 in the previous grouping, which is the sentence on such other persons as the Council considers likely to be affected. I think it's hard to imagine that apprentices or staff wouldn't be affected by changes in the frameworks, or indeed that the framework changes couldn't benefit from the input of apprentices or trade unions and staff. And so on that basis, I'm wondering if the Minister could explain why they weren't included on the bill in Amendments 6 and 7.
Minister.
I thank Pam Duncan-Glancy for raising these similar points again. Just to reiterate for clarity and completeness, there was no intention from myself and the government to deliberately exclude. What we wanted to do was create amendments that were tight and well drafted, that had the possibility for inclusion of a wide range of stakeholders. But similarly to the debate in the previous group, I note and appreciate the points raised by Pam Duncan-Glancy, and together with Pam Duncan-Glancy we can consider these further. I think the member will also share my concern that we don't want to have a very long list. So there's a consideration there about just appropriate drafting and consideration. So we'll consider this further, including in terms of Amendment 87 as well. So I will just conclude on the intervention there, and just in terms of my opening remarks, I will conclude by saying I will listen carefully to the debate on all the other amendments in this group, and set out more of my views in closing remarks, Convener, and I move Amendment 6 in my name. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I call Pam Duncan-Glancy to speak to Amendment 84 and other amendments in the group. Ms Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you, Convener. Amendment 84 says that where the framework relates to a foundation apprenticeship, it must deliver industry recognised qualifications, including structured, externally supervised work-based learning, and be co-designed with employers. And this is in a similar vein to my colleague Will Rennie's amendments in the last grouping, is to ensure that industry and employers can recognise the skills that have been learned during and through foundation apprenticeships. And so that's why this amendment 84 in my name has been brought in. I understand concerns about the definition and naming foundation apprenticeships on the bill. I don't share them, but nonetheless I understand it. But I hope that members could at least consider that foundation apprenticeship should be delivered with industry recognised qualifications as part of them, and have structured, externally supervised work-based learning and be co-designed with employers. If those principles are agreeable to members, then I hope that they might support Amendment 84.
Thank you very much. I call on Miles Briggs to speak to Amendment 85 in the name of Stephen Kerr and other amendments in the group. Mr. Kerr.
Thank you, Convener, and I feel I have now completely morphed into Stephen Kerr's apprentice in this committee meeting. And I am speaking to amendments 85, 89 and 90, which stand in my colleague Stephen Kerr's name. These amendments deal with the frameworks that underpin Scottish apprenticeships. The substance of this group is technical in appearance, but it goes to the heart of the credibility, quality and responsiveness of the apprenticeship system. And my colleague has lodged these amendments because the bill as drafted does not provide enough assurance that the apprenticeship framework will be governed in a way that reflects the needs of employers and expectations of learners and the long-term economic interest of Scotland. Amendment 85 seeks to ensure that apprenticeship frameworks are not treated merely as administrative instruments, but as structured, carefully designed programmes that must meet clear standards of relevance and quality. And Stephen Kerr's amendment makes it explicit that frameworks must be delivered by whichever body is most suitable, whether that be a college or local authority. This is crucial because a framework does not reflect the realities of the sector or the local environment it is working. It quickly becomes obsolete, and when this happens, it is the apprentice who pays the price in diminished opportunities and reduced employability. Amendment 89 adds a further essential element by requiring regular reviews of apprenticeship framework. Scotland's economy is evolving rapidly, technology is changing, workplace practices at speed, and industries are rising and declining, and skills that were once considered sufficient 5 or 10 years ago are no longer adequate today. Yet the bill provides no guarantee that frameworks will be periodically reviewed to ensure they remain current. The amendment in my party colleague's name introduces that guarantee. It ensures that frameworks are not left to stagnate and that they can be updated in line with technological processes, shifts in employer demand and emerging opportunities for the Scottish workforce. This amendment provides the system with the dynamism that's needed in modern skills economies. Amendment 90 strengthens the accountability around the creation of these frameworks by requiring that their development is undertaken in consultation with those who rely upon them, employers, industries, learners and training providers. Stephen Kerr has argued consistently that one of the weaknesses in the current system is the distance between policymakers and practitioners. Decisions are too often made centrally without sufficient engagement with key stakeholders who understand what a competent worker in their field actually needs to know and be able to do. And Amendment 90 corrects this by embedding consultation as a statutory requirement rather than a discretionary courtesy. This will prevent frameworks from being created or amended in isolation and ensure that they are grounded in real labour market intelligence. And I know the Minister will be aware of Edinburgh College, as I am, and some of the work it has undertaken in its net zero courses to link with employers, for example, to have heat source pumps, which they will be working on, provided, to have skills-ready, workforce-ready employees. And I think that's a live example of what's being achieve. So taken together, Amendments 85, 89 and 90 put in place a coherent structure for the development, consultation and review of apprenticeship frameworks. They ensure that the apprenticeship system does not become detached from the world of work. They support a model in which frameworks are rigorous, industry-informed and adaptable, and they serve the wider principle that my colleague Stephen Kerr has championed in his Stage 1 speech, that Scotland's apprenticeship system must be an engine of productivity, not merely an administrative category within tertiary education. Convener, if Scotland wants an apprenticeship system that commands the respect of employers, inspires confidence in learners and drives economic opportunity, then the frameworks at its core must be robust, relevant and regularly renewed. And these amendments help to achieve that. They strengthen the bill in a practical and necessary way, and I invite colleagues to support Amendments 85, 89 and 90 in the name of my colleague Stephen Kerr.
Thank you. I call on Willie Rennie to speak to Amendment 29 and other amendments in the group. Mr Rennie.
I will support the Minister's amendments in this area, and they do assist that partnership approach with employers, with business, with industry and others. I'm proposing we go further. I think the consultation addresses the concern that it exists amongst many employers that transferring the responsibility from SDS, that has a close relationship with employers, many employers, to the SFC, whose traditional arrangements have been with universities and colleges, needs to have a more robust consultation element within it. So, although it might be a bit more cumbersome, it might be a bit more challenging, I think it's necessary in order to make sure that we have a partnership approach and that employers understand that it is a partnership, that we do have a degree of co-designing, and also we are intent on strengthening that relationship for the longer term, not just the period following this discussion and this debate. So that's why I'm proposing that we go a little bit further, not an awful but further, because there will be degrees of consultation which are included in the Minister's approach. But I think we should embed that as an important part of rebuilding the relationship with employers.
Thank you very much. I call on Ross Greer to speak to Amendment 86 and other amendments in the group. Mr Greer.
Thank you, Convener. So, Amendment 86 is pretty straightforward. It specifies that before amending or revoking an apprenticeship framework, the Council may consult with such persons as it considers appropriate, and that the Council must publish their reasons for the amendment or revocation of a framework as soon as is reasonably practicable afterwards. As has been mentioned already, this is similar to the Minister's Amendment 6 and 7 and Willie Rennie's Amendment 29. I'd be happy not to press my Amendment 86 at this point and to support the other amendments if the Minister is able to say in closing that he would be amenable to revisiting this at Stage 3. I think what's specifically missing from his proposal, but that's included in mine and that I'd welcome as amending in at Stage 3, is that point that the Council must publish their reasons for any changes or revocations that they've made. I don't think that that is a cumbersome requirement to put on them, but particularly in the case of fully revoking a framework, I do think it's reasonable to expect the Council to, when they're doing this, to simply lay out their reasons for doing so. So if the Minister was amenable to working on that ahead of Stage 3, I'm happy not to press Amendment 86. Amendment 87 adds that when ministers are making further provisions in relation to the process that the Council should follow when they're preparing, publishing, amending, revoking, etc., the frameworks, that they should include details on consulting with apprentices and those representing them. So in a somewhat similar space to Willie Rennie's Amendment 29, which is about employers, mine is about 87 and specifying how that process should in turn be specified. I wasn't clear from the Minister's opening remarks what the Government's position is in relation to my Amendment 87, so as well as clarification on that point in relation to 86 and potentially working to a Stage 3 amendment around compelling the Council to publish their reasons for any changes that they make, if the Minister could in closing just clarify the Government's position on 87, because if it's in a similar space, again, I'd be happy not to press it. We can work together towards Stage 3 amendments, but I'm not sure if that is what he was indicating in relation to 87. Thanks, Convener.
I call Monica Lennon to speak to Amendment 88 and other amendments in the group. Ms Lennon.
Thank you, Convener, and I'm grateful to the committee for all your diligent work on the bill. I will restrict my remarks to Amendment 88 today, and it's only 7 words, so I'll try and keep this short and sweet because it's been a long session for everyone. it really is quite a simple proposal. It seeks to strengthen the Scottish apprenticeship framework by giving ministers the option to, through regulation, make further provisions about consultation with trade and industry representatives. And the Minister knows through work we've done together in the past around construction that I do take a keen interest in apprenticeships, and it's through discussion with industry bodies, including representatives from the Scottish Joint Industry Board for the electrical industry in Scotland, the SGIB. I thought I'd read it all out just to get it on the record, because that includes representation from employers through Select and Industry Trade Union through Unite the Union. And when you think about the electrical installation apprenticeships, SGIB would be the ideal body to represent those undertaking those apprenticeships to make sure that they and their interests are protected going forward. I know that the government won't want a long list of bodies and stakeholders on the face of the bill, but I think given the unique contribution that industry and trade bodies make in terms of representing the professional interests, but also working closely with trade unions and apprentices, that it certainly would strengthen the bill and certainly not create too much of a headache, I hope. Keen to hear from the Minister, but he knows that I would be happy to have a meeting with him and officials if he can't support it today. But as I said, it's 7 words. It is seeking to strengthen the bill in a really simple way, and hopefully the Minister can see the merits of that.
Thank you. I call on the Minister to wind up. Minister.
Thank you, Convener, and also to members for the debate on these amendments in this group. And it's important that we do all that we can together to ensure that appropriate and relevant stakeholders and delivery partners are involved in apprenticeships and are engaged in the development and amendment of the frameworks. And these amendments that have been proposed are important in that regard. Therefore, very sympathetic to the spirit of Ross Greer's Amendment 87 to respond to him on that, which seeks to engage representatives of apprentices and prospective apprentices in the process, as also Pam Duncan-Glancy raised with me in her intervention during my opening remarks. I would ask Ross Greer not to press this amendment, as he has kindly suggested as an option, so not to press it today, but to let us together consider further how we could improve the bill at stage 3 in that vein. Moving on, while I understand the rationale behind Pam Duncan-Glancy's Amendment 84, I cannot support it because the provision for what we are now calling foundation apprenticeships is made through the work-based learning in the bill as drafted. I am not proposing that to be subject to the framework requirements which apply to Scottish apprenticeships. This approach was arrived at as part of development of the provisions of the bill as introduced for Scottish apprenticeship and work-based learning through the extensive engagement prior to introduction with the SFC, SDS and SAB Short Life Working Group on the apprenticeship definition. So the context and engagement prior to introduction that I also referred to in the last group. In terms of Stephen Kerr's Amendment 85, this seeks to put colleges and local authorities ahead of private training providers in terms of delivering training of apprentices to meet the requirements set out in the apprenticeship frameworks. I do not believe that this is necessarily appropriate. I'm keen to see the mixed economy of public and private provision continue. Furthermore, the relevant requirements of an apprenticeship are not expected to be prepared with a view to who would provide the training, but rather the required standards or qualifications to be achieved. The remaining amendments set out in the group set out other stakeholders, set out which other stakeholders to be consulted or involved by the SFC in preparing, publishing, amending and revoking frameworks. Amendment 88, as we've just heard from Monica Lennon, covers trade and industry representatives. Amendment 89, in the name of Stephen Kerr, covers employers and representatives of industry within the relevant occupation or activity. Amendment 90, in the name of Stephen Kerr, covers representatives of managing agents and training providers, and I can see and understand why members have put these amendments forward. Clearly, there are a wide range of people, as I emphasised earlier, who could be involved in the process. There is also a case to avoid a long list of potential consultees on the face of the bill, not least because of the risk of someone important being overlooked. That was the thinking behind the drafting and the openness that is in the current and in the government amendment. So it would be preferable to leave this to regulations, in my view. But I appreciate there is an appetite for more detail on the face of the bill from members. I've heard that clearly from around the table today. So I'll therefore give an undertaking to give all of these considerations more thought ahead of stage 2, and happy to engage with colleagues on those points.
Monica Lennon.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you, Minister. I think it's fair what you're saying, Minister. There's obviously a risk if you put too much on the face of the bill in terms of a shopping list of stakeholders, but there's also a risk by not referencing key groups, and I think that's the point that you're perhaps accepting today. So I would welcome the opportunity to meet with you and other colleagues here, but also to understand why some of the bodies that I've mentioned today are nervous that there would be a future danger if there isn't that, opportunity to regulate on the face of the bill, which still gives control to government, because they are concerned that that would be detrimental in the future. So I think getting the wording right is important, but if I don't press today, it's just to get that commitment that there will be time for that dialogue.
Minister.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you to Monica Lennon. I think today, if colleagues are agreed, let's get Amendments 6 and 7 passed in my name, which include such other persons as the Council considers likely to be affected. It includes that inclusive approach, and then I'll consider, as I've said, Amendments 88, 89 and 90, and obviously also given an undertaking to consider 87 from Ross Greer, and then we can think collectively how to get this balance right at stage 3. Yeah.
Pam King Glancy.
I appreciate the minister's point, and it is my intention to support Amendments 6 and 7. But can the minister commit that that will not be the fact that we've said we would accept it at this point in the absence of any other option? Frankly, will the minister accept that accepting it now is not a reason for the minister not to engage and not to bring an amendment to add people representing trade unions and also learners at a future stage to the bill?
Minister.
I give my undertakings in good faith that I will be pleased to engage on these points and on the amendments and the themes within them ahead of stage 3. So I ask members to vote for my amendments 6 and 7 and also for 8.2. Moving to Willie Rennie's amendment 29. I listened carefully to the points made by Willie Rennie in response to my opening remarks, and I would like to have further engagement with Willie Rennie ahead of stage 3 on those points raised, to just emphasise to further consider the also points that were raised during an earlier group around making sure that we have the necessary input and expertise from the business community and from industry, and to consider together if there's a need for some further independence with regard to that. So happy to have further engagement on 29 if Willie Rennie is not to press it. If he was to press it, I would encourage members to vote against it at this juncture, and similarly to Ross Greer's Amendment 86. As I've stated, I'd be grateful if Ross Greer did not press Amendment 87, so we can consider this further together. But if he does, I encourage members to vote against it, and the same applies to Monica Lennon's Amendment 88 and Stephen Kerr's Amendments 89 and 90, as we've already discussed. And as I've said, I cannot support Pam Duncan-Glancy's Amendment 84, nor Stephen Kerr's Amendment 85. I would encourage members to vote against both. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. The question is that Amendment 6 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 84 in the name of Pam Duncan-Glancy, already debated with Amendment 6. Pam Duncan-Glancy, to move or not move?
It moved.
The question is that Amendment 84 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We are not agreed. There will be a division. Those in favour of Amendment 84? And those against? The result of the vote on Amendment 84 is yes 3, no 7. Amendment 84 is therefore not agreed to. I call Amendment 85 in the name of Stephen Kerr, already debated with Amendment 6. Miles Briggs, to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 7 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 6. Minister, to move formally?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 7 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 29 in the name of Willie Rennie, already debated with Amendment 6. Willie Rennie, to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 86 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 6. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 87 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 6. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 88 in the name of Monica Lennon, already debated with Amendment 6. Monica Lennon, to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 89 in the name of Stephen Kerr, already debated with Amendment 6. Miles Briggs, to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 90 in the name of Stephen Kerr, already debated with Amendment 6. Miles Briggs, to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 8 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 6. Minister, to move formally?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 8 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 91 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 26. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Not moved.
So we go to Amendment 92. Yep. I call Amendment 92 in the name of Pam Duncan-Glancy, already debated with Amendment 26. Pam Duncan-Glancy, to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 93 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 26. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Not moved.
The question is that Section 4 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are agreed, and I think that is a suitable point to stop our proceedings today. That concludes our consideration of the bill at stage 2. I'd like to thank the Minister and his supporting officials for their attendance today, and the committee will continue its consideration at its meeting on the 3rd of December. I now close this meeting.